Okay, so yesterday I got a little tired, and I think it's time that we get back onto this. Okay, I want to watch some more caving videos, cause why not? Okay, what's going on wrong? The Indian Springs cave.
Explain the story
If
now.
you're an Illinois homeowner that
The end
Yeah,
of it.
yeah, I didn't say you couldn't. Okay, as a creepy, ominous noise plays in the background.
So I didn't get a virus, which was good.
Man, that's like surviving Russian roulette 5 times. Hey, Yukon! Nobody asked! Shut up!
But it said hackers were watching, so from then I get nervous and cover cameras on my iPad at all times.
I always do that. Like, if you ever look at some of my streams, you'll notice my camera is all fallen. It's not pointing to my direction. I point that down every time I get off. And camera's not. Camera's got a little bit of a tilt on it. I don't. Anyway, yeah, I always cover my cameras. I always face my iPad like up, pointing up when I'm changing, and I go over to this corner. I started doing that because I was watching a Scrubby video, how they were going on the dark web, and I found like this entire website where people's webcams were just casually on like display.
Okay.
is more than $67 a month for electricity, you may qualify to go solar for $0 out of pocket. In 1991,
Cave exploring gone wrong. The Indian Springs cave disaster.
Expeditions in Indian Springs Cave in Florida.
I love caves. I wish I could
First
explore
dive
caves.
These expeditions, a horrifying event occurred that is so rare that it has still yet to reoccur in the 30 years since the incident. This is their story. In Florida, there is an area known as the Woodville Karst Plain that stretches from Tallahassee, Florida, into the Gulf of Mexico. This 400 square mile area is known as a karst landscape and is made up of limestone and other soluble rocks. The soft limestone easily dissolves in water, so rainwater and other flowing water slowly erode the rock over time.
Nice.
As a result of this erosion, karst landscapes are often
Must be hot over there.
caves, underground streams, and
Must be
sinkholes
stormy,
on the
maybe.
surface, and steep rocky cliffs above ground. In fact, the Woodville Karst Plain is home to the largest underwater cave system in the entire United States. One of the surface connections into this expansive cave system is an unremarkable looking pond known as Indian Springs. Located in Wakulla County, Indian Springs leads down into the Indian Springs cave system that's at least 300 feet deep and at least 2 miles long. In
That is twice the dive limit.
Woodville Karst Plains project, a dive was planned in November that would be conducted by this team.
Dude, I was diving in the deep end of the pool. When I went head first, we're not diving, but I swam down head first into the bottom, and only by 10 feet, I could feel the pressure hit.
I got a 5 bites from Mositos.
Oh. Hey, as I was saying, I got like the pressure hit my freaking ears like a train. You could really feel it, even 10 feet down. Now, the maximum dive limit is about 50 meters, or roughly 150 feet. I think it's like 143, but roughly 100 feet. Because if you dive too bad, if you dive below, apparently, according to a video I just watched, every minute you spend in the deep water, you have to spend 10 minutes. Because if you don't know this, you actually cannot just dive up instantly. Because oxygen or nitrogen bubbles will form in your muscles, and that's called bends or decompression sickness. And you have to wait in the water. It's like, yeah, you have to slowly wait for it to go down, and then you can leave. On one gruesome detail, there's these guys that were in this tank, and it was supposed to depressurize them while they sit and relaxed. It broke, and this guy got sucked through and depressurized throughout this whole parts just get freaking destroyed or something. I think there's an episode called like sucked out of a hole by Kuxer. It's pretty gruesome.
An accomplished group of cave divers on Earth. They had already set a bunch of records for depth in the cave and time spent underwater, and this was going to be the first in a series of dives in the cave to explore some potential leads. These dives had already been planned for almost 2 years at this point, and they had even developed special decompression tables because of the extreme depth of the area that they were going to be exploring. Joining the support team was experienced diver George Irvine. This was going to be his 77th cave dive and near his 1,000th technical dive, but despite all of that experience, he was still somewhat scared of cave diving. Every time
he's dived in a cave like this?
For having made it out again. And this is going to be his first dive with the team of any significance. The system had been
on mobile, I suggest you use something known as Video Shop. And if on PS4 or 5, you can use.
Had assigned everyone some tasks,
no.
even if it was just something contrived,
Yeah, no,
just to
like
get
Fear
everyone
Factory.
involved. There would be 3 teams in the water that would actually enter the cave. The first team would place one set of gas bottles. The second team, consisting of George and another diver, was going to place a second set of bottles for the traverse. And finally would be Parker Turner and Bill Gavin to complete the exploration. Bill had been part of the initial exploration that had discovered the leads in the first place, and any remaining crew would act as support from the surface. For the type of dive that they were doing, known as techno diving, they were going to need 2 types of gas mixtures. On the traverse, they would use a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, and then they would switch to a trimix of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen on the deepest section to mitigate nitrogen narcosis. This is a phenomenon that occurs when certain gases in regular air have a narcotic effect at high pressures. On November 17th, the teams arrived at...
I can't wait to start doing ARC maybe at the end of this month.
The spring itself is a little pond in a clearing surrounded by trees. There's a boardwalk that goes down to the water side, and there's even a little dock floating in the middle of the spring. Team 1 dipped below the pond surface, and
that's
made
beautiful.
their way to the bottom and then to the cave entrance. Team 2 went next and made the same descent, and finally, Parker and Bill entered the water for the longest and most challenging dive of the 3 groups. Teams 1 and 2 would place all the equipment first, and then Bill and Parker would be on their way in.
I have some good news. Do you live in the United States, and if so, which state do you live in? I'm not trying to get personal. Just wondering.
So I might make animations.
Like, what? Do you live in the U.S., and I wonder if you do, what state do you live in?
I live in the Oak City, Chester Village, Huntington.
Oh, you live in the UK. Alright, but I will say I live in Illinois, United States, and I have some good news for you.
Sandy Way, not Huntington.
I don't know if it applies to the UK, but I may or may not have seen. Well, I went to. I'm not like a PlayStation player, but I went to the Xbox section, and frankly, they actually had Xbox Series S in stock. So we could actually start seeing the Xbox and PlayStation start to come back to stores. The big pro that Xbox has over PlayStation is that Xboxes are stupidly cheap. You could be, I think my Xbox 360 was purchased with like $100 or $200, where this PlayStation was purchased for $500.
The traverse to the area where the leads were found was about 40 minutes. Then they would spend around 25 minutes exploring at 300 feet, then another 40 minutes to leave again. From the pond floor, there is a cavern that eventually turns into Indian Springs Cave. This cavern leads into a tunnel that extends for a couple hundred feet into an area known as Squaw's Restriction. The cave narrows here to a point that just a single diver and their equipment can get through at once. After that, it opens up once again to a series of winding tunnels that are made of rough yellow and white limestone. Thankfully, because of how popular the cave is, there are permanent lines fixed almost the entire length. These lines help to guide divers even in poor visibility. Bill and Parker made the long traverse through the winding tunnels until they made it successfully to a massive room known as the Wakula Room. They spent the allotted time searching around, and then at around 63 minutes, they started to make the traverse back. Unbeknownst to them, a rare and horrifying event was occurring that is one of the only like it to have ever occurred in diving history. On the way back, they picked up their nitrox bottles, and Bill checked that he had plenty of gas left in the tanks on his back. As they were doing this, Parker signaled that his underwater scooter was running slowly.
I don't know, 12 to 16?
Pulled both of them using his scooter. They were only about 15
Oh my god. I have to say this right now again. Does anybody know what Subnautica is? Because if you do, I use something like a Sea Glide from Subnautica. They're called like aqua scooters.
I'm 11.
Oh. Anyway, these are like these little scooters that will have these propellers and they'll pull you through the water. And damn, they're fun. I love them so much. This guy was trying to escape Germany when in the 1960s they were communist reigned. So this guy tried to swim away to this boat offshore, and he couldn't. But he built this device that would pull him through the water. In over 4 hours, he escaped Germany, went to the United States, and patented the design and sold it across the country. Yeah, so this guy used this thing to tread ice-cold waters and escape communist Germany.
I'm learning Russian.
Dude, I was learning. The only Russian phrase I know right now is "Это дом," which means this is home.
Wow.
Yeah, the guy's impressive. He basically traveled throughout cold water, too. And he had to submerge, too. Which, sadly, the thing that I have, it does not submerge. If you submerge it, it'll go into this air pipe and it'll shut the machine off. If you're wondering, if you let go of it, it'll actually circle around you instead of just going off alone. And boy, does it wears your arms down. Because it's pulling on your muscle, it aches your arms, but it's hella fun. I love using that little thing.
This would use up his battery more quickly. Eventually, they reached a distinctive arrow marker on the line about 5
Ray
feet
Sabat,
from
nice
the
to meet
entrance.
you.
On the way in, Bill estimated that the point that they would reach that marker would be about 105 minutes into the dive, so they were perfectly on schedule. Then they made the left turn following the marker and noticed that visibility had decreased. Although they had been pretty careful on the way in, they might have still kicked up some
Boilers.
so it wasn't anything to
This is
worry
a
about.
boiler. A boiler is a tank that is used to boil water.
Completely obscured by a billowing cloud of silt. Thankfully, the line ran along the ceiling.
Yeah.
That was clear. But as they continued, visibility just kept getting worse.
These actually help heat the water of a
Eventually, they
building.
stopped
I'm
using the scooter and switched to holding the line because of how bad visibility.
Actually, if anybody at one of you has ever heard of State Farm, I've actually been to their corporate center, like their headquarters. I've been in their basement. My dad used to work there, and we would always take trips across the facility, and he would show me how big their boilers were. These 4 giant tanks that were used to heat the building's water.
Wow.
And I'm telling you, down there, it's like a maze of tunnels, weaving and winding, with tons of pipes on the ceilings that snake everywhere. They snake left, right, center. And the best part, there were there were scooters. Like there was these buggy carts, and my dad would always say, "Oh, they're dead." But now I realize that he was just lying because back then he used to take my sister there, and he would play quote unquote GTA. So like she would get on one cart and he would follow her on another, and they would chase each other throughout the complex. What routes? Oh, if you're talking about people know like how they get around the building, that they do. But damn, it like she even showed me to this kitchen. There's these giant mixing machines, like mixers, like like a cookie mixer. Mixers are like probably like about 2 or 3 feet. Actually, I'm starting to use meters, like probably like a meter across. Pretty big ass like soup mixers or cookie mixers.
Wow.
In fact, my dad has this giant mixer. It's like about like a third of a meter across. It is amazing.
When they got to the area where Squaw's restriction should have been, the line just disappeared into the sand. They started pulling on the line to pull it up out of the sand, but
Cave in.
it went so deep that they couldn't even pull it out. Right where Squaw's restriction was, there was tons of sand, and visibility was less than a foot. Bill heard Parker shout, asking what this was, and then the two of them backed up and removed their stage bottles and scooters. The stage bottles were just about empty at that point anyway, so they switched back to the tanks on their back. Whatever this was, it seemed like it was going to take a long time to figure
I think
out.
it's a cave-in.
There were 2 fixed lines, so the first thing they did was check the one they weren't on, but it also led directly into the sand. This made no sense. They had just come.
They're basically what's happening is that they're doing an underwater dive, and I guess they can't see through this one squeeze, which I've addressed this another time. I hate cave squeezes. They give me anxiety because there's this thing called Nutty Putty where this guy slid into something known as the birth canal. Now, the birth canal at Nutty Putty is this really tight squeeze. I'm telling, when you squeeze through this canal in a cave, there's like 1 inch.
Will watch any of my videos.
I could, yeah. Anyway, there was this squeeze. Literally, you could get stuck. Even if you were skinny, even if you were like muscular and built, you would get stuck at this little tiny squeeze. Nutty Putty had this one guy who got stuck, and he actually ended up dying because he got stuck upside down. If you don't know, your human body is made to work with gravity. When it starts pumping oxygen or blood,
Like a stick.
yeah, even if you're like a stick, it will get you. I'm talking, if you think this is hard, try squeezing that guy through that canal. Probably like squeezing is trying to get maybe like a stove through a door, like a 1 meter wide door or like a 4 foot wide door maybe,
That's
without touching the walls. Yeah, it's insanely scary. If I go spelunking ever, which is in America, it's called spelunking. If I ever go spelunking, I'm never going for a squeeze. I've actually went to this place called the Sea Museum where there were simulated caves, and squeezes are scary because you can't turn around. You have to go forward or backward. And if you're and here's the scary thing about caves. If you're stuck and you didn't call for people, you're dead. No one's gonna help you. You're stuck there. And well, what happened with Nutty Putty, that guy that got stuck, he died. And it became his grave. They cemented the cave entrance up, and his remains were still inside. That's when the federal government shut down that cave.
wow.
It's a pretty spooky story of how wrong a cave expedition can go.
Super scary.
It is. Cave squeezes give me some damn anxiety.
5 minutes after George and his partner passed through Squaw's restriction, the
But
water came rushing past.
if it makes if you ever lose your hope in humanity, just search up cave rescues. There are people will literally dig shafts. They will literally like throw as much money at you to get you out of a cave. Like bruh, cave expeditions or like cave rescues are actually really, really cool. There's so much dedication to them.
The bottom turned into a sandstorm.
Do you want to
George
do a
thought that
chat
his
song?
scooter had somehow turned on and was
I'm
bouncing
fine.
around, bumping into things. But in reality, the decompressing divers were creating bubbles that floated up and changed the buoyancy of the rocks on the ceiling. The momentarily heavier rocks then broke away from the ceiling and plummeted down and caused a mudslide directly into the path of Squaw's restriction, completely covering it up. By the time Bill and Parker returned, there was no longer a way out of Indian Springs. On the other side of Squaw's restriction, Bill attached his reel to the main line and started to search around for the way out. From what he could see, although he didn't know how, it seemed to be blocked with sand and rock. But with visibility so bad, he couldn't tell what had happened or if he was even in the right place. He eventually noticed a light flow of water, so he followed that for a bit. But after searching some more, he doubted that they were actually at Squaw's restriction. Maybe they had made some sort of mistake on their way out. While Parker continued to search, Bill swam back out about 300 feet, back to find the arrow again. He just stared at it, trying to ensure he hadn't misread it or made some silly mistake. When he was absolutely sure he was right, he swam back into the sill and back to Parker, and the two of them spent the next 45 minutes desperately trying to find a way out of the sand, burning through their gas tanks the entire time. Bill and Parker eventually checked their pressure gauges and realized that they were getting very low on gas. Parker grabbed his piece of slate and wrote "What do we do?" on it and then handed it to Bill. Parker obviously hoped that the more experienced Bill had some idea, but Bill had no clue either. The only thing he could think to write was, "Hold on, I'll go look," and then he tied his reel to the main line and started a sweeping search again. Again, he found nothing, so he went back, but even though he was gone for less than 5 minutes,
it's done.
Parker was nowhere to be found.
Oh, they were probably
Bill grabbed
blocked.
his sage bottle and breathed from it for a little bit, using that time to think.
If you don't know, here in America, I especially where I live in Illinois, it is awful to dive. It's awful diving conditions. The water is mucky. You cannot see more than 3 feet in our water. And usually, because we're so far up north, right now it's like hot as hell, because what happens is that these storms roll in, and then that water in the air heats up like a microwave, and it starts making the air so humid and awful. It's hot as hell outside. Like, if I go in basically clothless, if I go in there outside naked, I could only last like 5 minutes.
I am in the middle of moving.
Where you going, buddy? Where are you moving to?
Wow.
I actually love like earth science, chemistry. In fact, if you actually pan my thing over, you can actually see a periodic table. I love science. No, South Dakota. Oh my God! You want to know what you need to see? There's this pyramid that was built. I think. Hold on. Is it in South Dakota? Oh, it's in North Dakota. Anyway, this pyramid was built in the Cold War to defend against Soviet ICBMs. There's this giant pyramid, right, out of concrete. It would scan for missiles, and if it found a missile, it would shoot a retaliation missile to knock it out of the sky. But it was called the Safeguard Program. And the United States government, the United States civilians actually protested against the Safeguard Program. And because of this, it was eventually...
How to sound Indian. Replace T with D and say don't tell me what to do.
Anyway, so the Safeguard Program was heavily scrutinized by the United States civilians, and they shut it down. There were supposed to be 12 of these pyramids, there's only one. And I don't know, I think in the 21st century, this pyramid was sold and auctioned, and somebody, a civilian, got it. So that means out there's a civilian that lives inside of a nuclear pyramid. Can you imagine the bragging? Hey, yo, I live inside of a pyramid that used to shoot nukes. Oh my God. Yeah, and...
Don't tell me what to do.
Hold on. Safeguard Program. It was shut down because nobody liked it. Here's what it looks like in Dakota. Here is the Stanley R. Mickelson nuclear site. Actually, I need to turn my brightness down because if it's all the way up, here it is. This is what it looks like. Block. And those circles on the sides, those are radars, because if you don't know, I know I'm sorry for not playing the game right now. Huh?
Wow.
If the pyramid is right here, and this is the globe, right? If the pyramid's right here, it can actually scan here, and if a Soviet missile goes over, it will go above the line, and it'll scan it, and then that pyramid will shoot a missile and pop it out of the sky. Which upon then, after it destroys the missile out of the sky, it will send retaliation missiles to the Soviet Union and absolutely decimate them. Because if you don't know, in the Cold War, you could, like, people were scared that a nuke could hit any second. And you probably have heard this song called Duck and Cover. Now, duck and cover means that you duck under your desk at school and you cover your head. Even though, if you know what a shockwave of a nuclear bomb does, it does not help. And, like, the hardest part of a nuke to survive is probably the shockwave. Because what happens is when a nuke goes off, this giant shockwave goes through and it destroys any structure in its path. It'll knock over skyscrapers, completely obliterate homes. Basically, if you're caught in a nuclear shockwave, you're almost gonna die. Within a mile of the nuclear blast, there is no hopes of surviving, as fireballs hotter than the surface of the sun will completely disintegrate atomic bonds. Basically, back then, in 1958, the Soviets developed something known as Tsar Bomba. Now,
even if Putin got crazy, it wouldn't happen because a bunch of other people have to agree. Every single one has to agree to it.
Here's the problem about a nuclear war. Nobody wins a nuclear war because imagine two people, right, on a beam with a gun. If person A, like right here, he shoots person B, he kills his enemy, but he loses balance on that beam and he falls. Nobody wins. Literally, it's basically like everybody, like, it's like, imagine, actually, there's this, it's kind of creepy, but there's this German short called Balance, where there's these four people, and they're dehumanized, and they have to sit on this platform.
Situation.
And if one of them moves on the platform, it doesn't balance the thing. It doesn't balance the platform. And all the other guys have to move. So what I'm trying to use as an analogy is that if somebody shoots or launches a nuke, everybody dies. Russia launches one, the entire world's gone. The United States launches one, the entire world's gone. It's called mutually assured destruction. It is one of the scariest concepts in the world. Basically saying, hey, if you're going to destroy us, we're going to go down with the ship. Which is why nukes should literally be disassembled. Now, thank God the Tsar Bomba was not reproduced. Now, nukes are measured in these things known as kilotons and megatons, which means that that's like a ton of TNT, right? A kiloton equals 1,000 tons of TNT. Now, if I'm not wrong, a ton is about 2,000 pounds. Actually, I should be nice. I'm not trying to, like,
The Russian dead hand.
hold on. kg. How many kg is a ton? That way I can. Okay, so about 1,000 kilograms. Actually, hold on. U.S. ton. So U.S. ton's about 907 kilograms, if you're wondering. So a kiloton is 1,000 tons. So 1,000 times 900, which should be about, I think, like 9 million, I think? I don't know. A megaton is 1,000 kilotons. The fat boy and the fat man and little boy that was dropped over Nagasaki was about 20 kilotons. Fat Man was more powerful because it had plutonium in it. Plutonium is a non-natural element. Any element after uranium does not naturally occur because it's radioactive and it destroys its structure. Thus, meaning that uranium is the heaviest element on Earth. Anyway, so now that we got this sense of scale, the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki was I'm mixing myself up. It was 20
My
kilotons.
phone's running low on power, so I might go.
Alright. 20 kilotons, right? Now, remember, 1,000 kilotons, megaton. You wanna know how big Tsar Bomba was? 58 megatons. That is over 6,000 times stronger than the Fat Man. This bomb was so powerful, it sent shockwaves across the world 3 times. It shattered windows as far as 100 miles away. It absolutely obliterated anything its path. It made a 5-mile wide, roughly 2 kilometers wide, a 5-mile wide fireball that obliterated everything in its sight. And I think it caused earthquakes. Luckily, or actually, the Soviets that dropped that bomb, they said, hey, you have a 50% chance you are going to die today. But there is actual footage of this bomb dropping. However, rest assured, because only one of these bombs was made, and the one that they did make was eventually detonated. There are non-armed reproductions of them, but luckily it has never been rebuilt. They were trying to get to 100 megatons. They got to 58, which is pretty scary if you ask me. So it's a big bomb. Like, I don't know if my calculation is correct, but that's basically Mount Everest converted to gunpowder. Would probably be, roughly the same as a Tsar Bomba. So basically, Tsar Bomba, if you converted probably my entire country into TNT and consolidated it into basically what would be probably like 5 blocks long. Which makes nukes absolutely scary. Nukes are just freaking... The scary thing is, like, we're the only species that literally knows how to... we literally will kill any other species out on Earth. I like how humans have the audacity to call other species invasive when we literally will kill anything on the planet. Another fun fact is, if anybody has ever heard of the Davy Crockett. Now, this weapon was insanely powerful. It actually inspired what is known as the Fat Man nuke launcher from Fallout 4. The Davy Crockett, you can call me a liar, I'm not capping here. It was a miniature nuke launcher that could launch a nuke roughly bigger than a football. If those living in the UK, like an American football, I'm not like being mean, but like Football in the UK is actually, soccer in the United States, just to clear up the misconception. So basically like this size, basically around like a third of a meter long, or maybe even at most half. It was a recoilless gun, which it shot 1 kiloton miniature nuclear warheads, which, wow, that is dumb. The fact that you can actually launch those baby nukes that far, they launched them up to like 2 miles too, I think. Or I know at minimum it was a mile, and it absolutely obliterated it. In 1973, however, they were shut down and they were defunded by the United States government. But can you imagine if nukes were allowed? Can you imagine the look on a terrorist's face as they see a damn Davy Crockett move onto the battlefield? They know they're effed at that point. Like, you're done when you see a baby nuke launcher go onto a battlefield. And actually, good news today. Speaking of terrorists today, a terrorist that was leading Al-Qaeda, or was a high leader member of Al-Qaeda, was killed today, or killed sometime around the time I'm speaking of this, which is pretty good. We got one of those little bastards. They don't deserve to live. Nothing makes me as an American more happy than seeing terrorists get shot. I don't know if apparently he got airstriked or something, but damn, it's always great to have a few less terrorists on this planet. Who likes terrorists? Only terrorists. I'm gonna continue that video.
Each bottle empty. All he'd had left is a few minutes of air in the tanks on his back. After 4 minutes, the stage bottle was out. Parker still wasn't back, and he was just minutes from drowning. He frantically searched again, and this time found a line attached to the main line. In his panic, he didn't understand how it got there, but he followed it anyway. Then there was a small opening in the restriction. In it was the second stage of a regulator, which again, in his state, he didn't quite register exactly what that meant. He freed the regulator and then saw a line ascending almost straight up and out of the restriction. Then, almost completely out of air, he raced up to the next set of bottles 100 feet up. Just as he was about to run out of air, he reached the next set of bottles, basically on a breath hold. But, despite making it to the bottles, there was no relief. Parker was not there. These were the same bottles that Parker should have been using also. It was at that moment that
Parker's
Bill
dead.
realized Parker had drowned. He realized that the regulator he found was Parker's, the line that he followed was Parker's, and in the poor visibility, Parker's body was probably floating around somewhere in the silt. So he just sat there waiting for support divers to find him. Up on the surface, just after the cave-in, the pieces that broke loose and the sand that was displaced caused the water from the spring to rush in and fill the space. As the water was flowing to fill the new area, the water level was actually observed by the surface crew to drop by a foot or so. Then suddenly, it stopped lowering as Squaw's restriction got blocked up with sand.
Knew that's what was happening.
All of the silt to the other side of the restriction shortly before it was blocked.
If you don't know, silt is this gravel, sandy substance at the bottom of a river.
Still with no idea what happened, George was confused to find that his scooter was in the same place he left it. Now, you'd think that this would be concerning for the surface team to see all the water all of a sudden drop like it did, but this is actually not uncommon. Caves and springs often raise and lower depending on the water flowing within them. The outflows are often not known, and sometimes, for whatever reason, water flows more quickly out of them, causing the water level to drop. There are even a few recorded occurrences of entire lakes disappearing entirely, only to reappear later. Lake Jackson, for example, in Florida as well, drains entirely for years at a time. But then George and his partner eventually noticed the silt was returning once again, and now they were starting to get really uncomfortable with the weirdness of the whole thing. The team above had already gotten out, but they were still about 20 feet below the surface, so George decided that he should go down again and briefly check things out. He swam down to about 110 feet, and everything seemed to be fine from what he could see. He checked out the bottles and saw that they were still fine, but from how deep he was, he couldn't actually see the now completely remodeled squaw's restriction. The silt that he was seeing was actually the result of the restriction reopening and all of the silt from the other side filtering back over. Thinking that everything was okay, he returned to the surface and he and his partner finally went up and out of the water, but his partner looked completely freaked out. He just seemed to have a bad feeling about the whole incident. He asked George if he had seen either of them, and George replied no, but the bottles were still there, so everything should be okay. Then another one of the support divers popped his head out of the water and was asked if everything was okay, and if he had confirmed the visual contact of the pair. He confirmed that he saw Bill, and his partner confirmed that he had seen Parker, and that Parker had even waved at him. The support diver then said, that wasn't Parker, that was me waving at you. Upon hearing this, George's partner immediately turned to him and said, something isn't right here, I'm going back down to check, and then dove back into the water. About 2 minutes later, he resurfaced and told George that he had found Parker's tanks hanging on the line and that he and Bill were not with the tanks. They both went down after that and tied into the line because visibility was still almost zero in that section. Then they started searching in the murky water, desperately hoping to find Parker and Bill before it was too late. At some point, George ran into someone and realized that it was Bill, and he wasn't moving. Then he noticed he was breathing, so he checked his pressure gauges to ensure he had gas, but Bill just sat there, not acknowledging George. Eventually, he pulled out a slate and passed it to him, and George realized why Bill was acting so weird. On it, it said, Parker is dead. George's heart dropped when he read the message. He just sat there for a second, staring at the slate, not registering the full meaning of the words. When he snapped back into it, he realized that Bill was probably in some state of shock. He needed to ensure that he had enough to breathe for however long he'd need to decompress. He tried to communicate this to Bill, but he was clearly out of it. He couldn't get him to move, and Bill didn't seem to care if he even had enough gas to keep himself alive. Eventually, George tied a reel to where Bill was and swam to the surface to tell the others. When he surfaced, he tied to the dock and got himself together before finally saying to the others, Parker is dead. He was barely even able to get out the words. He exclaimed to the others that someone had to go down and get him because he wasn't moving. He told them where he was and to follow his line, and within seconds, another diver had his tanks on and was getting back into the water. They eventually moved him from where he was to a better spot, where he had to stay and decompress for 4 hours because of the additional time he had spent at depth.
Exactly.
Over that time, Bill was filled in with as much information as they could give him about what they knew, but for a while, he had no idea how much the cave had collapsed or if anyone else was missing. Thankfully, he would exit the water without physical damage from decompression sickness because they hadn't actually been quite as deep as they expected while exploring. In the meantime, George tied back into the main line and started desperately sweeping the cave, looking for his friend's body in the silt. After 9 passes, he eventually ran out of gas before finding any trace of Parker. When he exited the water, he even forgot to decompress and got minor decompression sickness as a result. By the time he finally exited, cops and dozens of other people were swarming the area. Among the crowd were other cave divers familiar to the team, suggesting that Parker may have found an air pocket or something along the cave roof. George tragically reassured them that the depth where he ran out of air would have made this impossible. The team explained to police that they didn't have enough gas to make any more attempts that day, and so they'd have to return the following day after resupplying. 2 men from the group drove to Parker's house and broke the news to his wife, while the others returned to the individual who owned the compressor to refill the gas tanks. Bill's van was parked outside the house, and that's where he sat all night, collecting himself. The following morning, he emerged from the van and rejoined the group back at Indian Springs, where he laid out the plan to clear the restriction and then bring Parker out safely. But the police arrived shortly after and told the divers that they had already entered the water at 6 a.m. and retrieved the body. Ironically, it was Parker who had taught the local police how to conduct dives and how to do body recoveries. The friends he had made during that time teaching them didn't want to leave him in the water any longer. After analyzing the incident countless times, the divers think they figured out the sequence of events. Around the time Bill felt the flow of water, Parker must have felt it as well. Parker, unlike Bill, had actually found the source of the flow, which was a small hole in the restriction. Almost completely out of air, Parker decided to take his tanks off and squeeze through. He tied his safety spool into the main line and then dragging his tanks, forced himself through the opening. After making it to the other side, he unfortunately ran out of gas and passed out around 30 feet from the decompression tanks. When he passed out, he dropped his tanks, they landed on the line down below, and then he floated to the ceiling because of the positive buoyancy of his wetsuit. It seems that by forcing himself through, he cleared the restriction even more, allowing Bill to squeeze himself through with his tanks just a few minutes later. Parker's tanks had also landed on the line, positioning it directly outside of the hole, giving Bill a perfect guide up and out to the decompression tanks. Had it not been there, Bill isn't sure that he would have made it. A delay of even a single minute meant that he might have drowned as well. As of a paper published in 2015, this is the only known cave dive death that was due to natural causes rather than human error. The effect of decompressing divers on the surrounding cave system is now a widely known phenomenon because of this incident. Unfortunately, it just wasn't well known then. Following the events of November 17, 1991, many of the divers from the team stopped cave diving altogether. George and Bill took some time off, and George almost stopped entirely as well. Eventually, they slowly returned to diving once again, and at some point, George invited Bill down to Mexico to do some cave diving. In a film about the Woodville Karst Plains project, Bill would later say, "A day has not passed that I have not thought about Parker."
Oh.
If you made it this far, I just want to thank you for watching. This is part 12 of the series, Cave Exploring Gone Wrong, so if you enjoyed this video, you may want to check out the other videos in the series. I'd also really appreciate it if you have a like and subscribe if you aren't already, so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Once again, thank you so much for watching. And
They shouldn't be alive. Woman trapped under ice for 80 minutes.
Turn cash back.
God, that's scary. Getting trapped under ice. There's nothing you could do. You can punch. But as your body gets cold, you start to fail. Ooh.
On April 2nd, 2013, 19-year-old Reshma Begum got a job as a seamstress at a local clothing factory in the Dhaka
A person that
Bangladesh.
makes
The
like
factory she was
fabric.
working at was in the nearby Rana Plaza, where she
Very
was making
fancy word,
4,700
seamstress.
takas, or the equivalent of $60 a month. Rana Plaza was an 8-story commercial building that housed a few clothing factories, some shops, and some apartments. That
Looks like
together held
India.
about 5,000
How would there be
people.
ice?
The building itself had originally been planned to be 5 stories, but later 3 were added to increase its capacity. These additional floors had been protested at the time of construction by some engineers as unsafe, because the original building permit had only been approved for the original 5 floors. In addition to the extra rooms, the permit was given for commercial use rather than industrial use, as it was now being used for the clothing factories. On April 23, 2014, a TV channel captured what appeared to be cracks that had formed along the side of the building. Immediately following this discovery, the building was evacuated and the shops on the lower floor were closed for the day. Later that day, the owner of the building told the media that the building was safe and that workers should return the following day, and one company, EtherTex, even threatened to withhold a month's pay from anyone who refused to come to work. On April 24th, Reshma
That's
returned
scummy.
to work at her job at the clothing factory to find a crowd of employees refusing to enter the building. She was reassured by managers outside of the building that there was no problem and to head on in and get to work. That morning, there was a power outage in the building, and so the diesel generators on the top floor were started. Shortly following that, at 8:57 a.m., it sounded as though an earthquake was taking place to locals nearby as Rana Plaza collapsed. The horrible cracking, grinding sound was mixed with the screams of her colleagues as the building collapsed around Reshma. When the noise stopped, Rana Plaza was just a pile of rubble and a cloud of thick dust, but Reshma was alive. She woke sometime after the collapse in complete darkness with a pounding headache from the head trauma she sustained during the collapse. Confused and disoriented, Reshma crawled around to try to find a way out, but unfortunately, she was trapped in by all of the rubble. Nearby, she could hear a trapped man calling for help, but Reshma couldn't reach him through all of the rubble. Over the next few days, she would listen to him ask for help and for water, but unfortunately, there was nothing she could do, and eventually, the man went silent. On the surface, rescue efforts were underway to save anyone alive trapped in the rubble. However, days later, Reshma remained in total darkness, eating what little she could find in the small area she was trapped. A week went by, Reshma remained in total darkness. After 2 weeks, the food and water she had run out, and Reshma had lost all hope of being rescued from her concrete prison. Finally, on day 17, rescuers got close enough to where Reshma was trapped that she was able to hear some of their voices. After some more concrete was removed from the area that she was trapped, she started frantically hitting the metal rods in the concrete. And at around 3 p.m. on May 10th, a rescuer noticed the faint tapping. He rushed to the spot it was coming from and knelt down, looking deeper into the rubble, and heard the voice of Reshma Begum say, "Sir, please help me." He shined his flashlight into the rubble and saw Reshma standing there, unharmed, 17 days after Rana Plaza had collapsed. It took about an hour of hammering and drilling and sawing away at the rubble to finally reach her, but eventually a military engineer was able to climb down into the space where she was resting. She would later be eased
Nice.
out on a stretcher and taken to the hospital nearby. In the collapse, 2,500 people were injured. 1,500 of these had been buried in the rubble, and a total of 1,134 died in the accident. Official
Dude,
investigation.
to make that's a lot of people. That's a third of the 9/11 survivors, and that's actually more than the tri-state tornado has actually killed. 1,000 people killed. That's traumatic. That's jaw-dropping. That many people
That a number of
in such a
factors
small
ultimately led to
building.
the collapse of the building. In addition to the additional floors and the industrial factories that were illegally operated in the building, poor quality construction materials were used to build it. When the diesel generators were turned on the day of the collapse, the vibrations from them were the final straw to the already unstable structure, causing the building to collapse. Reshma Bagum would go on to make a full recovery, but vowed to never work in another clothing factory again, and the Rana Plaza collapse remains the deadliest, non-deliberate structural failure in modern human history. Born in 1970 in Vänernborg, Sweden, Anna Bagenholm was born into a large family of 8 kids. At 29, Anna was studying to become an orthopedic surgeon and went off to do her residency in Narvik, Norway. She would later become a surgeon assistant at Narvik Hospital, where she would become close friends with a woman named Mary and a man named Torvald. Anna was also an expert skier, and she would often ski after work, and occasionally the three of them would go together. On May 20th, 1999, Anna, Marie, and Torvald were skiing on a route they had taken plenty of times before, and Anna lost control of her skis and went careening down the mountain. At the bottom of the mountain was a river covered in a 20-centimeter thick layer of ice, and with Anna being unable to stop, she landed right onto the ice on her back, and her head actually broke through the ice. The area she landed was also near a waterfall, and so she was immediately sucked under the ice by a current,
Undertow.
the rocks and the ice, leaving only her feet and skis out of the water. When her friends out, but the way that she was wedged made it impossible.
Oh boy.
Thankfully, under the ice, Anna had managed to find an air pocket, but her torso, her upper thighs, and her head were basically fully submerged in freezing cold water. To pull her out, and about 7 minutes after
I think I'd rather I'd rather die from heat than cold.
6:27 p.m. Police organized 2 rescue teams, one at the top of the mountain and one at the bottom. They actually even managed to convince a rescue helicopter that had just left with a sick child to turn around and pick up Anna as well. Under the ice, Anna struggled initially, but after finding the air pocket, remained motionless while waiting for rescuers. Anna was trapped under the ice for 40 minutes waiting for rescuers as they skied down the mountain as fast as they could. By the time they got there, she had gone into cardiac arrest and was limp under the water. They first tried to pull her out with a rope, but when that failed, they tried to dig her out with a snow shovel, but it couldn't break through the ice. Rescuers from the bottom of the mountain eventually arrived with a metal-pointed gardening shovel and were able to cut a hole in the ice and pull Anna through. They pulled her through at 7:40 p.m., 80 minutes after she had fallen in. When she was pulled out, her pupils were dilated, her blood wasn't circulating, she wasn't breathing, and her core body temperature was only 13.7 Celsius. Mary and Torvald, both doctors, began CPR as soon as Anna was pulled from the ice, despite knowing that she was clinically dead at this point. After being loaded into the helicopter, Anna was given ventilated oxygen while rescuers continued to administer CPR. They even used a defibrillator on her, but nothing seemed to have any effect. The rescue helicopter arrived at the hospital just over an hour later at 9:10 p.m. One doctor on site would say that Anna was as pale as any person he had ever seen and appeared to be dead without a shadow of a doubt. With that said, because of the cold Norwegian climate, doctors on site were very familiar with treating hypothermia. So although Anna was technically dead based on her symptoms, people with hypothermia are not pronounced dead until they're warmed up. At 9:40 p.m., Anna was connected to a cardiopulmonary bypass machine, which is a machine that circulates and warms the blood outside of the body before recirculating it back into the body to warm the core body temperature. At 10:15, they managed to get her core temperature up to 36.4 Celsius and recorded her first heartbeat. Anna would spend the next 10 days in a coma and the next 35 connected to a ventilator. On May 30th, Anna woke up paralyzed from the neck down.
Damn!
When she awoke, she was actually angry at her friends for saving her because she was scared of living the rest of her life as a quadriplegic. Remarkably, Anna's condition would continue to improve and she would eventually regain control of her body. It would take another few months for Anna to recover fully, and to this day she still has some lasting nerve damage to the areas that were fully submerged. Her recorded body temperature is actually the lowest temperature ever recorded where an individual would go on to survive. Following this incident, her case has been used to inform the medical community about the potential therapeutic effects of hypothermia following cardiac arrest. Because Anna's body
What a
got so
trooper.
cold prior to the heart attack,
This
her
woman is the
metabolism had
embodiment of a
just
trooper.
10% of its regular rate. Under normal circumstances, cardiac arrest is particularly damaging because the oxygen-starved tissues around the body begin to die. With her slowed metabolism, the tissues needed much less oxygen and therefore suffered much less damage than what would normally be caused with cardiac arrest. Due to her nerve damage, Anna was unable to finish becoming a surgeon, but now works as a radiologist at the hospital where her life was.
Damn, what a badass job. Radiologist.
Throughout his
Working with
childhood,
radiation
David
and stuff.
Titomello idolized his older brother Lewis.
No
His
Man's
older brother
Canyon.
was 13 years older than him, and by the time David was entering garden, Lewis was heading off to university. When David was old enough to head off to university, Lewis suggested Kansas University, which was just a short trip away from where he was now teaching at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. David would end up choosing Kansas University and went on to spend the weekends at his brother's house. It was during this time period that they had their first period of intense bonding. Before this, the age difference was too big and they only had ever spent short periods together on holidays. It was with his older brother that David would be introduced to all kinds of food and music and where the two of them would really get to know each other. And although this was a great time in their lives, after David finished college, the two brothers parted ways once again, and David went to work at a college in Nebraska and Lewis went to live in Colorado. It wasn't until decades later that the two of them started going on adventures together once again. In his time living in Colorado, Lewis had climbed most of the 14,000 footers that made up the tallest mountains in the continental United States. Later on, he
Nice.
shifted to technical climbing and rappelling and asked David to join him on some of these expeditions. Lewis, now in his late 60s, challenged his younger brother David, now in his 50s, to practice climbing and get certified so that the two could go on trips together. David would take him up on this challenge, and under his brother's mentorship, David would also become a capable climber. On Sunday, March 6th, the two brothers were on a day hike in No Man's Canyon in Utah as part of a longer one-week trip that would last until the coming Friday. At around 9 a.m., David and Lewis hiked into the canyon's North Fork and traversed through the tight sandstone walls. At around 1 p.m., after completing 4 shorter rappels, the pair were on the first stage of their final rappel for the day. Now 70 years old, Lewis took extra care to set up all the ropes and gear meticulously to ensure a safe descent from the canyon. Stage 1 was a 40-foot rappel down to a ledge 100 feet off the ground.
Basically, like,
After
taking a
getting to the
rope
ledge,
and
the
then
pair would descend the
climbing
final 100
down.
feet to the bottom of the canyon and then hike back to their camp for that evening. For their descent, they would be using a 60-meter rope, which is roughly 197 feet long. The rope is then folded in half to form 2 even strands that are then looped through a belay device which acts as a brake as the climber rappels. The middle of the rope is marked with tape to ensure that the strands are even, and then each length is 98 feet of rappelling distance. The two descended into the canyon, onto the ledge one by one, with Lewis going first. Lewis's cardinal rule was that the most experienced climber went first, and so he always went first. Once they got down to the ledge, they pulled the rest of the rope down and began rigging it up for their final 100-foot descent, which would use every last bit of rope they had. Lewis rigged up the rope to the canyon wall's anchor point, checked the rope's midpoint to ensure the strands were even, and threw both ends down into the canyon. Lewis then clipped his harness to the rope and carefully backed down towards the edge of the ledge they were on. Before descending, he told David to watch his hands to make sure that they didn't get scraped along the rocks as he went over the side. He then carefully eased himself over the edge and disappeared into the canyon. Shortly after going over the edge, Lewis called out to David that it goes fast, indicating that because there are no walls to brace yourself, you're essentially in free fall as you go down. A second later, David heard, "Oops, the rope is short." A split second later, he heard, "No biggie, All his life, when David heard Lewis say, "No biggie," that meant that he had things under control. And the almost mythical status that Lewis had in David's mind made the next sequence of events seem impossible, if not for the fact that he witnessed them firsthand. Another split second later, the end of the rope zipped through the rappel ring on the ledge David was resting on.
Oh
With
shit.
that, he knew that his brother had just plummeted to the bottom of the canyon. Horrified, David listened for a yell, a crash, a call, anything. He called out over the ledge for his brother, but no answer came. He called a few more times and came to the terrible realization that Lewis was either dead or seriously injured and had taken the only rope they had to rappel off the ledge with him. David began trying to climb back the way they had come, but above him was just 40 feet of smooth rock. He attempted over and over without climbing shoes, and due to the difficulty of the climb, he fell down over and over back onto the ledge. During one of his attempts, he heard Lewis groan from below, and David went to the edge and screamed his brother's name, but got no response back. He knew that if he could just make it out of the canyon, he could get help and save his brother, but without any way to get out, he knew his brother would die. Realizing that he couldn't make it up the 40-foot smooth face, David sat down on the ledge and began to weep, knowing that his brother was surely going to die just 100 feet below him. After about an hour of mourning, David began to take stock of his situation. Prior to leaving, the pair had printed out a map with a detailed itinerary of each of their stops on their trip. In addition, on the last night of each of their trips, David and Lewis would always call home to their spouses to let them know that they were safe and at the hotel before returning home the following day. On Thursday night, when this call should have arrived, their spouses would know something was wrong and then call the authorities. David's expectation was that he just had to make it to Friday, when it was likely that rescue crews would arrive. This would mean that he would need to survive the next 6 days on a small ledge in a canyon on just a single orange, a single energy bar, half a sandwich, a small bag of cashews, 16 ounces of water, and a liter of tea.
I would drink the water. First of all, I'd glug. If I glugged the water like after that, I'd wait out 2 days maybe. You're slowly ration the water.
The temperature dropped close to freezing.
Human body can survive 8 days without water, 30 days without food,
To use as a pillow.
or 20 days without food or something. I don't know.
Get worried about whether or not the rescuers would find him, and
Ow.
began taking inventory of the different pieces of rope he still had with him. Altogether, he had 3 separate pieces that totaled 83 feet in length, meaning the final drop would be over 15 feet. Fearing the rope wouldn't hold or the drop would injure him too severely, he decided against it. On Friday, he had just a single sip left of water. He had lost 15 pounds, and
Ah,
his fingers
that
and
looks
toes
cool.
were succumbing to frostbite as he endured the cold nights. He spent that day hopeful that a helicopter would appear over the horizon and take him off the lonely ledge. Instead, darkness crept over the horizon, and nothing came to his rescue. He went to sleep that night fearing the rescue would never come. Thankfully, he was woken up that night to the unmistakable sound of a helicopter dropping into the canyon. It shined a light into the canyon where the ledge was, but it never landed directly on him, and soon after, the helicopter flew away. The helicopter hadn't seen him, but he at least knew that rescuers were looking for him, and the following day, the helicopter returned and spotted Lewis's body, and then David resting on the ledge above. David was taken to a hospital in Moab where he was treated for dehydration and frostbite. More or less physically unharmed, David would take months to emotionally recover from the ordeal and the loss of his older brother Lewis. It's unclear exactly what happened to the rope that day, although it's believed that the tape to mark off the middle of the rope had moved over the course of the day, leaving 2 unequal ends for rappelling. However, it seems as though Lewis didn't actually fall. Lewis's body was discovered in such a way that it looked as though he thought he was close enough to a ledge to jump and land safely. He seems to have missed the ledge and fell further than expected, and then broke his pelvis upon impact, pulling the rope with him as he fell. David would later come to grips with what happened and would be quoted saying, "I love my brother and he loved me, and in those moments in the canyon, you didn't have to speak it, you knew it." If you made it this far, I just wanted to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I also wanted to say hello to all of the new subscribers.
Horrifying encounters with predators.
Lash Paradise Mascara from L'Oreal.
Dude, I saw this one video of this guy walking away from like a mountain lion or a mountain
When you
tiger.
hear the word predator, what do you think of? I would imagine that many of you are picturing a great white in dark water, a tiger in thick green jungle, or even a grizzly in a dense forest. And certainly, those are predators, as fearsome and as dangerous as anything you might encounter on Earth. But I think there's another variety of predators, those that are human in form, accompanied by all of the malice and evil that can't be ascribed to the aforementioned cold-blooded killers. And so, for this series, you're going to hear a mix of stories from each of those categories. In either case, the encounters you're about to hear are highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Oh boy.
downtown LA is an area known as Griffith Park. Although bordered on all sides by the LA city streets and often compared to Central Park in New York, Griffith Park is considered to be much more rugged and untamed than Central Park. It has a total area of over 4,000 acres and lies on the east end of the Santa Monica Mountains. So the entire area has hills and valleys and forests and even some caves. The park is even large enough that despite being bordered by LA on all sides, a variety of different animals inhabit the area. One day, a man who was living in LA decided to go for a run in Griffith Park on one of the hiking trails that went through it. The trail he planned to run was an 8-mile loop starting in a parking lot, so he was going to
8
park his
miles,
car
I
and
could
buggy
not
loop
do
back
that.
to where he parked. So he takes off running, and at about the halfway point, he realized that he misjudged the amount of sunlight that he had left. The sun was going down a lot faster than he expected. What he figured was that the
If you look at the sun, every finger you put, and you put the sun at the bottom, 15 minutes. You do this, it's an hour. Hour, like, if I say it's sun, hour, 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 hour,
because it is a really
hour.
popular park that usually has lots of people around. But as the sun went down, he started to hear the sound of something following him.
Oh,
Initially,
shit.
whatever it wasn't close, but he was definitely aware of its presence. Then, around the 6-mile mark,
Whatever you do, if you ever get stalked, is what I hear, is don't run. Once you run in a situation like that, like, if I were you, only run, maybe, if it's chasing you. If you run, it's gonna know that you noticed. If you just walk and notice it, it's gonna think that you haven't noticed it.
was ahead of him.
But just take it with a grain of salt.
Nervous, he knew he needed to make loud noises and make himself appear larger to scare.
That's also another thing I've heard, is that if you see a bear, you gotta appear large and make noises and ward them off. It only works with certain things, but take it with a grain of salt.
Whatever it was seemed to have gotten scared and disappeared into the woods. Then around the 7-mile mark, he heard the noise again, and this time it was accompanied by the sounds of several other animals that were all making yelping and cackling noises. So now he's in complete panic mode and he starts sprinting the final mile of the trail as fast as he could. The entire time he can hear the animals following him close behind. He finally makes it back to his car and rips his keys out of his pocket, unlocks his door, and jumps into his car and slams the door. Less than 10 seconds later, an entire pack of coyotes crept out of the darkness of the forest and into view.
Weird. Coyotes usually don't like people.
As he caught his breath, he counted 10 to 12 coyotes just standing there waiting for him, and it seemed as though they were trying to wait and see if he would come back out of his car. They only finally scattered when he started the engine of his car. He'll never know whether or not they would have actually attacked him, but it's safe to say that just the potential for it to have happened was a super scary experience considering how many of them there were.
Weird. Coyotes, I don't think, like.
One day around Halloween, a group of friends got together and were telling ghost stories to get in the spirit of the season. One girl in the group said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date, but was hesitant to tell it because it was actually a true story. It would take a bit of convincing, but after prodding her enough, she agreed to tell the story. Her parents' first date was a little bit awkward, but otherwise a nice time. So around the time that it was time to say goodnight and go home for the night, her dad suggested to her mom that they go for a midnight hike up the nearby Provo Canyon. Provo Canyon is a canyon to the east of Utah Valley and has beautiful rocky hills on either side of the Provo River. Her dad had done quite a bit of rock climbing in the area and knew the trail well, so despite it being dark, they'd have no problem navigating the trail in the light of the full moon. After pulling into the parking lot at the mouth of the canyon, they got out of their cars and started hiking under the dark, starry sky. At some point, her dad started to get a bad feeling. Because the pathway up ahead was going to pass through some trees, the light of the moon and the stars would be obscured and they would be walking in almost pitch black darkness. But he ignored the feeling and kept going. Her mom would later say that she had the same feeling right around the same time, but because she didn't know the trail as well as her husband did, she ignored the feelings as well and just kept going. About a minute later, her dad got the feeling again, and ignored it once again, and then started walking further into the wooded area. As he was walking, his foot hit something soft in the middle of the trail. Under the darkness of the trees, they couldn't make out what this soft thing was, but the bad feeling they were getting was back and stronger than ever. So instead of trying to figure out what it was, they both agreed to just run out of there. They would make it out of there without issue, and then after another little while of dating, they eventually got married. Years later, after already being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. In their interview, Ted Bundy was asked about the closest he'd ever been to
Dude, I've heard about this guy. This guy was a
He would
bad
later
person,
explain
if not
that one
wrong.
night he lured
Like a
girl
really
into
bad one.
Provo Canyon, and just after killing her, he heard people coming up He didn't have enough time
Hey,
to...
hold on, run it.
He would go on to explain that one night he lured a girl into Provo Canyon, and just after killing her, he heard people coming up the trail towards the body. He didn't have enough time to move the body, so instead he quickly hid in the trees and watched as they approached. He then watched the couple walk into the body and then weirdly turn right back around and walk back down out of the trail. They were horrified because there's no telling what would have happened had they stayed and examined the body a little bit further.
Oh my god.
Bathfitter doesn't
Dude, I saw another one.
with hundreds of custom designs.
There is a there's serial rapist, right? This guy was like the baseline killer, right? One of the worst killers in history. This guy got 9 death charges and 418 years in jail. Or no, in prison. Like, this guy was tough. This guy was staring in the window of this one lady, and she's like, "Can I come in?" She says, "No." And he left, apparently. That's scary, dude. Killers are scary. They're not like an animal.
It's a scientific agency.
They're not an animal that can like easily be outsmarted. They're humans that know how to use guns and shit. Oh my god.
Government that is responsible for studying the landscape of the country, its natural resources, and any hazards that threaten it. Starting in the summer of 1975, a woman named Cynthia worked with the Alaskan branch of the U.S. Geological Survey. The area Cynthia was working was somewhere known as the Yukon-Tanana Upland that is so remote that she and some other geologists had to be dropped in by helicopter. During Cynthia's second summer working, the budget was too small to even afford the helicopter, and so the group had to backpack into the area a week at a time. The following year, in 1977, the budget was increased and they were able to afford a helicopter once again. 5 geologists were flown in that year, and after getting transported to the 6,000 square mile Big Delta, they split up and mapped alone. And despite the isolation of the Alaskan wilderness, Cynthia always felt quite comfortable being alone. Every summer that the group worked in Alaska, they would see a variety of wildlife, including bears. The first bear she saw was a black bear walking slowly in the distance at the end of a meadow on a mountain. She immediately froze when she saw it, but the bear didn't see her and slowly disappeared into the
Dude,
forest.
bears?
On occasion, Cynthia was busy looking.
My mom told me a story of when they lived on this base, apparently. Hopefully I got the details right. But this guy went into the woods to hunt with a .22. Apparently, they didn't see him for a few days. And the man's body, well, they found him decapitated with a single swipe of a bear. He brought a .22 in. And he died. Dude, you do not F with grizzly, or or you don't F with bears. Dude, bears are just crackheads.
Underground for chips of rock to take back with her, when all of a sudden she heard some rustling. She lifted her head and saw a black bear about 40 feet away, walking on
Black
the trail she
bear.
was on straight toward her. As soon as the bear noticed her, it immediately took off into the bushes. This was reassuring because it seemed to confirm the reputation black bears have about being afraid of people. During her first 2 years working in Alaska, she'd only seen black bears. It wasn't until that third summer that she saw her first grizzly bear from the helicopter as they were flying into their drop-off point. She considered herself fortunate to not have encountered any in person because grizzlies are much larger and are considered to be more dangerous and unpredictable. Despite these encounters though, Cynthia's project chief always discouraged the group about carrying firearms because she thought that guns added more danger than they prevented. She figured that a wounded or angry bear would be far more dangerous than a frightened one, and so no one in the group carried a firearm. And no one was all that worried anyway, because they all carried walkie-talkies to keep in touch throughout the day. Everyone was also taught to try not to surprise a bear or get in between a mother and her cubs.
Yeah, you do
In
not want
addition
to.
to those safety precautions, Cynthia always tried to make lots of noise as she walked, alerting any nearby animals and giving them a chance to run before running into them. And for 2 summers, this worked perfectly.
How you doing?
Good.
At 8 a.m. on August 13th, 1977, Cynthia was dropped off on a rocky brush-covered ridge about 60 miles south of Fairbanks, Alaska. Her goal was to take notes on the geology of the area and collect samples with her rock hammer, and then record the area where she took the samples. That day, she was wearing khaki work pants, a cotton shirt, a pair of sturdy hiking boots, and she had a rucksack to carry all of her supplies. In the left pocket of her rucksack was her walkie-talkie covered by a flap, and in her right pocket was her lunch.
Place it in like a cool area. Do not cover it up.
and crackers.
I've had that happen to
Over
me.
the course of the day, standard procedure was to make contact with the other geologists in the area and base camp by walkie-talkie get picked up by the helicopter at the base of an 8-mile ridge where it met a river. She was pleasantly surprised to find that the area she would be surveying had a small bulldozed trail that might have been used for logging at some point, making her walking a little easier through the brush. The area that she was in was also slightly more populated than the usual areas they surveyed, because there were a few small cabins 15 to 20 miles downstream. That morning, she didn't expect to see any bears because in addition to the area having a few more people than usual, it was really dry and rocky. You'd expect that if you were going to see a bear, it would be towards the end of the day near the river. Cynthia continued down the trail, chipping away at rocks as she went, slipping samples into her rucksack, when all of a sudden there was a loud crash in the brush 10 feet away. She was relieved to see that it was just a small black bear standing up in the bushes looking directly at her. She knew she needed to get the upper hand right away, and so she immediately shouted commandingly at the bear, yelling at it to leave her alone, but the bear stood there motionless, just glaring at her.
Uh-oh.
Then she clapped her hands and yelled even louder, but the bear didn't move at all. Instead of turning and running, the bear started walking slowly toward her.
Oh,
Eye
shit.
contact the entire time. Cynthia yelled and waved and clapped wildly and even banged her rock hammer on the rocks, making as much noise as she could to intimidate the bear. But this black bear was not acting like a black bear was supposed to. Starting to get nervous, Cynthia took a step back to elevate herself to seem more dominant, but the bear darted around the outcropping beside her and then around her. In the next split second, she felt a massive blow to her back, and then she was thrown forward and landed face down on the ground. Then she froze deliberately, remembering being taught that playing dead was supposed to cause an attacking bear to lose interest. But instead of losing interest, Cynthia felt a stabbing pain as the bear bit deep into her shoulder. Then she felt herself getting shaken violently in the bear's mouth. The bear then stopped for a second, almost as
Dude,
if it
bears?
was looking to see if she was still alive. Cynthia tried to lie perfectly still, trying to confirm to the bear that she was no longer living, so would leave her alone.
Dude, bears are scary. Bears can take bullets. Like, I'm pretty sure bears can survive 22s, which makes it scary. So if you ever have to fight if I ever had to fight a bear, I'd bring like a shotgun or a 308 or a 50 cal, because bears are just tanks. They can take a lot of pain and they can deal. Yeah, they're beefy too. Especially the black bears too. Black bears are just a freak of nature.
Pocket of her rucksack to get her radio. She felt around, trying to open the pocket, but the strap was buckled too tight, and she couldn't get it off without taking her rucksack off her back. Detecting this movement, the bear bit into the flesh on her upper right arm, and Cynthia felt her flesh being torn and the teeth against her bones. She also knew that unless the bear left her alone, there would be no way for her to call for help while it was attacking. After chewing her right shoulder and arm, the bear started to bite into her head, and Cynthia could actually hear the sound of crunching as the bear's teeth grazed her skull. As the attack continued, she realized how powerless she was. Although this was just a small black bear, it was just way too strong to fight. Even worse, despite the strength of the bear's attack, Cynthia still felt very strong and very conscious, meaning she knew that this would be a long and horrible ordeal, until she finally bled to death from the wounds. She was even thinking that this had to be the worst way to die imaginable, and considered shaking her head to try to get the bear to kill her more quickly. Eventually, the bear grabbed her by her mangled right arm and began dragging her down the ridge. Every 20 feet or so, the bear stopped and panted into her right ear as it rested. And this would continue for almost 30 minutes as the bear pulled her over rocks and through bushes by her arm. Finally, between her 20-pound pack and her 130 pounds of body weight, the bear needed to take a more substantial break. It walked a few feet and then sat down to rest, still watching her closely. Cynthia knew that this was the chance she needed. Not only had the bear stopped attacking, but the side of her body the walkie-talkie was on was facing away from the bear. She slowly reached back and felt that the buckle that prevented her from grabbing her walkie-talkie before had been ripped off at some point during the struggle. She then pulled the radio out of the pocket, snapped the switch, pulled up the antenna, and then said loudly, "Ed, this is Cynthia. Come quick, I'm being eaten by a bear." And she specifically used the word eaten because she was convinced that this was no longer just a mauling or a bear playing with her. She repeated the message once again and then called out her location, but midway through her sentence, the bear jumped to its feet and attacked the arm that was holding the radio. This time, she screamed in pain as her remaining good arm was mangled in the bear's mouth. This was her last chance of survival. Cynthia had done everything she could to save herself, and she had no idea whether or not anyone had actually heard her call. She didn't hear the normal static or return call and knew that the antenna hadn't been extended fully. She was also down in a ravine, and there were endless mountain ridges between her and the camp radio. Cynthia knew that there was very little chance now, and so accepting her circumstances, she started screaming and yelling as the bear ate at her, no longer
Oh
trying
my
to hide her natural reactions. The bear then started sniffing down her thighs and calves, and Cynthia wondered if it would start on her lower body next. Too scared to look, though, she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, directly in front of her face. Then she felt her pack being torn open and the sound of cans crunching in the bear's mouth. As the bear ate her lunch, it gave her a brief reprieve from the assault to think about the horrible situation she was in.
Uh-oh.
Despite everything, her senses and her mind were clear. Cynthia thought about how this was going to be the way that she died, and how much she wanted to live and return
That's
to her
so
husband.
cool.
Another 10 minutes passed, and then she heard the faint sound of the helicopter in the distance. Then it got closer and circled around, and then horribly, she heard it disappear again in the distance. Cynthia wondered if it was maybe just dropping off another geologist, or if it was just a routine refuel, or maybe they had actually heard her call. Unfortunately, the helicopter had not come close enough to scare off the bear, and so it continued to slowly eat Cynthia alive.
That is not a good way to go.
Then she heard the helicopter again. This time it came closer and closer, and then it seemed like it was hovering right over her. So she kicked her legs violently, trying to signal to them that she was still alive. She figured that if it was hovering, it must have seen her, but then again, the sound of the helicopter grew distant, and eventually, there was nothing but silence. After giving up all hope of being rescued, and then allowing herself to think that she might actually be saved, she was devastated to hear the helicopter fly away once again. As she lay there, absolutely crushed, she realized that the bear was gone. The helicopter had at least managed to scare the bear away, and then miraculously, about 10 minutes later, she heard the helicopter return a third time. This time, she heard the engines shut off nearby, and then the voices of people calling out for her. Cynthia yelled back and directed them to her location. The pilot, Ed, was the first to spot her, and after getting 2 of the other geologists, they carried her up the hill and lifted her into the backseat of the helicopter. It was at this point that Cynthia knew she would live. Despite how badly mangled her arms had been, the bear hadn't attacked her torso, so all of her organs were intact. She just had to keep calm and let the doctors take care of her. But she also knew deep down that her body would never be the same from that day forward. Cynthia was first flown to the army base Fort Greely, where she was given blood and morphine. Then she was taken to Fairbanks and taken right into emergency surgery. Her left arm was unfortunately too badly damaged and had to be amputated above the elbow. In an attempt to save her right arm, surgeons grafted a vein from her left thigh to keep blood circulating into the damaged tissue. Over the course of 5 hours, 4 surgeons worked on Cynthia, removing irreparably damaged tissue, cleaning her wounds, and removing leaves, rocks, and dirt from the area. The following day, she was flown to San Francisco, where her husband met her in the hospital. Unfortunately, after days of trying to save her right arm, it would need to be removed as well. A blood clot had formed, and the pulse that she initially felt slowly disappeared, and the arm went cold. Cynthia remained in the hospital for 6 weeks following the attack and spent much of this time thinking about that fateful day. At first, she wondered why she hadn't bled to death despite her injuries. Doctors would explain that because she was young and in excellent physical condition, her arteries were young and elastic, allowing them to constrict and cut off blood flow. She also found out that her distress call had been heard by the pilot's wife at base camp. The reason that the helicopter had flown away the first time was that the pilot couldn't search effectively while also trying to fly the helicopter, so he had to pick up another person. It flew away the second time after spotting her because the area she was in was so rugged that they knew they would need a third person to carry her out of the ravine. Finally, Cynthia thought about why she'd been attacked. She figured that there were 3 possible reasons. First, the bear was asleep and she startled it when she walked into the area. Second, there were cubs in the area and the bear saw her as a threat. And third, the bear was just really hungry, and Cynthia was prey. Regardless of the reason the bear initially attacked, it's clear that at some point it did decide that it was going to eat her anyway. In the aftermath of the attack, Cynthia made a miraculous recovery. The bites on her head healed, and the hair grew back and covered the scars. Her right side was covered with new skin, and her left stump was strong and had good range of motion. She was fitted with artificial arms and resumed her work as a geologist, and with only minor adaptations to some of her instruments, incredibly, she was able to work just as efficiently as she had before.
If I were her, I would personally say, can you give me like a pick arm?
If you enjoyed this video, you may want to check out some of the other videos on my channel. If you want to support the channel, give this video a like and drop a comment down below. If you're new here, welcome to Scary Interesting. If this is the type of content you enjoy, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
They shouldn't be alive. Uruguayan
As experts in online education,
flight.
Purdue
Let's go.
University
Flight
Global,
571.
all the flexibility you
Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was traveling from Uruguay to Chile when it crashed on a mountain.
Uruguay. Uruguayan. Uruguayan or whatever, which is a South American country. Okay, we're good now.
Many of the passengers survived the crash, but were now stranded 60 kilometers from the nearest town and at an altitude of 12,000 feet. Rescuers were unable to locate the white plane against the white snow, and so the search was called off after 8 days. The surviving passengers spent the next 72 days in the mountains dealing with starvation, freezing temperatures, avalanches, and cannibalism. This is their story.
Oh shit.
On October 12, 1972, Flight 571 left Montevideo, Uruguay, and traveled west towards Santiago, Chile. The plane carried 40 passengers and 5 crew, including pilot Julio Ferradas and co-pilot Dante Laguera. The plane was carrying mostly rugby players from the Old Christians Rugby Club, and they were on their way to Chile for a match. Some of the remaining seats were filled by friends and family of the players. Typically, this is a straight flight, but a storm front forced them to stop over at night. From Mendoza, planes normally make a straight path directly to Santiago, 200 kilometers away, but their plane would need to make a U-shaped route because of the type of plane it was. This is because they were flying in a turboprop plane with a max altitude of 28,000 feet, instead of a jet plane which has a maximum operational altitude of around 38,000 feet. For those of you who don't know, the Andes mountain range is one of the highest in the entire world, and so this plane would need to fly close to its maximum altitude range the entire time, and would therefore require very precise calculations in order to make the flight path successfully. So instead, just to be safe, they would fly around the mountains in an area that was a little bit lower. The following day, on October 13th, the plane waited until just after 2 p.m. to depart from Mendoza to avoid some of the remaining storm clouds passing through the area. The pilot, who had made this flight 29 times already, was training the co-pilot, who was the one who was actually flying the aircraft. After they departed Mendoza, they flew south towards a radio beacon in Malargüe, and then after that, crossing the mountains in Chile, south of a city called Carico, the aircraft would then turn north and begin to descend towards Santiago. During their flight, visibility was poor because of the heavy cloud cover, so they used their instruments to navigate the plane. Shortly after reaching the radio beacon, the co-pilot radioed air traffic controllers that they would be reaching Carico a minute later. Now, the flight time from the beacon to Carico is normally 11 minutes, but after only 3 minutes, the pilot contacted air traffic once again and told them they were passing Carico and turning north. He then requested permission from air traffic to begin to descend, and they granted it to him, unaware that he was still solidly in the Andes Mountains. As the aircraft began to descend, severe turbulence tossed the aircraft up and down. One survivor would even say that the players joked initially about the turbulence, but then the plane hit a huge downdraft and dropped several hundred feet out of the clouds, revealing the mountains super close beneath them. Upon seeing the mountains, everybody in the plane got super quiet because the mountains seemed way too close. The pilots would have also gained visibility at this time and saw that they were now traveling right ahead of them. They immediately pulled back on the flight controls until the plane was nearly vertical, but the sudden change caused the plane to stall and shake. Then, the aircraft ground collision alarm sounded, indicating they were close to land. The quick maneuvering by the pilot managed to bring the nose over the plane, but at 3:34 p.m., the lower tail cone clipped the ridge of the mountain at 14,000 feet. Another collision a second later sheared the right wing completely off, and the plane was thrown back with so much force that it took the vertical stabilizer and the tail cone with it. After the first strike, the plane continued upward for another 600 feet before the left wing was torn off as well after striking an outcropping on the mountain. 2 more passengers were ripped out of the rear of the plane upon this impact. The fuselage then flew through the air before landing and sliding on a steep slope at 220 miles per hour like a high-speed toboggan for 2,000 feet before smashing into a snowbank and finally stopping. The impact crushed the cockpit and the 2 pilots inside, immediately killing the pilot and critically injuring the co-pilot. and the fuselage was now resting on a glacier in the Andes Mountains at 11,710 feet,
Damn.
80 kilometers east of its planned route. Of the passengers on the plane, 5 were killed on the initial impact when the tail section broke off. The 2 others who fell from the plane also died, one on impact, and the other one miraculously survived the fall, but as he descended from the glacier that he fell onto, he fell into deep snow and asphyxiated. His body was discovered by survivors almost 2 months after the crash. When the plane hit the snowbank, the force of the impact caused the remaining seats to be ripped from their anchors and thrown to the front of the plane, killing 4 more people, including the team physician. Of the 45 passengers, 33 remained alive, although many were seriously or critically injured with broken bones and other serious injury. Thankfully, there were 2 first-year medical students on board who were relatively unharmed and were able to act quickly and treat a bunch of the people with less severe injuries. Unfortunately, anyone with compound fractures couldn't be saved and would die shortly after the crash. One man named Nando Parado had a skull fracture and would actually remain in a coma for 3 days. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified within 1 hour of the flight going missing. On the first day, 4 planes also concluded that the plane had come down in one of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the Andes. On the second day, 11 aircraft searched the area and a few
Yeah. Give me a second.
October 21st, 8 days after the search began, rescue efforts were called off. Their only hope now would be to find the bodies in the spring when the snow melted. On the first night of the crash, 5 more passengers succumbed to their injuries. The others removed seats and other debris from the plane and made a crude shelter. Their home for the next couple of months would be an 8-foot by 9-foot space that remained from the plane. To keep out of the cold, they closed off the open end of the cabin with seats, luggage, and snow. They also removed seat covers to make coats and used seat cushions as snowshoes. To have water to drink, a man named Fido Stouch came up with a way of using some of the metal from the seats to melt snow into empty wine bottles. He also improvised sunglasses to prevent snow blindness, using the sun visors from the pilot's captain and some wire from the seats. Nando Parado awoke from his coma 3 days later to learn that his mother had died in the crash and his sister Susanna was critically injured. He attempted to keep her alive, but she would die on the 8th day from her injuries. Of the initial 45, 27 passengers now remained, most of which had lived near the sea and at low altitude. In fact, most of them had never even seen snow before. They now had to deal with nighttime temperatures of -30 without cold weather equipment, medical supplies, or food. Eventually, they managed to find a small radio and attach an antenna to it to listen to updates on the search. But because they were able to hear the updates, this meant they also heard when the search was called off. This was obviously crushing news for the group, who probably felt completely helpless at this point. In addition, because they were on a short flight, the survivors had next to no food. They only had 8 chocolate bars, a single tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of almonds, a few dates, some candy, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine to split between 27 people. Nonetheless, they divided it up into small amounts and rationed it for as long as they could. After about a week, they were completely out of food, and the hostile area they were in had no vegetation and no animals. So the survivors started to try to eat parts of the plane, like the cotton inside the seats, but that started to make them sick. Finally, upon finding out that rescue efforts were called off and facing death by starvation, the survivors decided that they had no other choice but to begin eating the bodies of their dead friends. This decision was obviously not taken lightly, as most of the dead were teammates, close friends, and even family members. Initially, many passengers refused entirely. Some tried, but couldn't keep the food down, but eventually, they had no other choice. Because they were so revolted by what they were eating, initially they just ate skin, muscle, and fat. But as time went on, and as the food supply dwindled, they began to eat hearts, lungs, and even brains. As if things
Holy
couldn't get any
shit.
worse, 17 days after the crash at around midnight, an avalanche struck the aircraft containing the survivors as they slept. It filled the cabin with snow and killed 8 more people on impact. And the individuals who survived were now trapped inside the cabin, and they were running out of air because the snow had only left a 3-foot gap between it and the ceiling. Thankfully, Nando managed to think quickly and grabbed a metal rod and dig an air hole into the roof of the cabin for ventilation. However, they were still stuck inside the cabin, and it would go on to take them 2 days to dig a tunnel in the snow to the surface. When they finally did reach the surface, there was a blizzard raging outside that left them with no choice but to stay inside the cabin. So they spent the next 3 days inside this extremely cramped space in the buried plane with all of the corpses of the people who had just died in the avalanche. Eventually, the snow that buried the plane began to melt as temperatures rose and the season changed from spring to summer. Decided that with the search called off, their only chance of survival would be to climb over the mountains and search for help. They began by making brief expeditions in the immediate vicinity around the plane to scout out the surrounding area. However, they found that altitude sickness, dehydration, snow blindness, and malnourishment made traveling any significant distance almost impossible. The group decided that a few select members would go and try to find help. They decided on 4 individuals, including Nando Parado, Robert Canessa, Numa Turcati, and Antonio Vizintin. These 4 were allocated the largest food rations and the warmest clothes. They were also spared the daily manual labor around the crash site that became essential for the group's survival so that they could save up their strength. On November 15th, they set out east, and after several hours of walking, they found the largely intact tail section of the aircraft. In and around the surrounding area they found a box of chocolates, some meat patties, a bottle of rum, cigarettes, extra clothes, comic books, and some medicine. They also found the aircraft's 2-way radio, which would allow them to transmit as well as receive radio signals. That night, they decided to camp in the tail section of the plane, so they made a fire and stayed up late reading comic books. In the morning, they continued east for a long while, And that evening, they slept outside for the first time and almost froze to death due to the lack of proper equipment. The following morning, they decided it would be better for them to return to the tail section and remove the batteries to take back to the large camp where the fuselage was, and then power up the radio to make an SOS call. Unknown to them was that the aircraft's electrical system used 115 volts of alternating current, while the battery only produced 24 volts of direct current, making the plan futile from the beginning. In the meantime, back at the fuselage, 2 more people had died due to gangrene from infected wounds. And still knowing their only option was to climb out of the mountains, they devised a new plan to make it out of there successfully. For this trip, they decided to climb over the mountains to the west of the camp. They also realized that without a way to survive the freezing temperatures at night, there would be no hope of success. Their solution was to create a giant makeshift sleeping bag out of insulation from the tail section of the plane, and using copper wire and waterproof fabric that covered the air conditioning of the plane. Unfortunately, on the 11th of December, Numa Turcati died of starvation because he was unable to eat the meat in large enough quantities because he was so disgusted by it. He weighed only 55 pounds when he died. This left only Nando, Roberto, and Antonio to make the trek out of the mountains. On the 12th of December, they set off from the main camp. Lacking any mountaineering experience or gear of any kind, they began to climb the glacier to the 15,000-foot mountain blocking their way to the west. Based on the aircraft's altimeter, they thought they were at 7,000 feet when it was actually 12,000 feet. And based on something the co-pilot said shortly before he died, they thought they were right near Carico on the western edge of the Andes. As a result, they only brought a 3-day supply of meat. Wearing 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters over a polo shirt, and 4 pairs of socks wrapped in a plastic shopping bag, Nando took the lead. They thought they might be able to reach the peak in a single day, but it ended up taking them almost 3 days. On the first night, they had a hard time finding a spot for the sleeping bag, and settled on a rock on the edge of a cliff. As a blizzard raged around them, the men slept on the edge of an abyss. Roberto would later say this was the worst night of his entire life. Over the next 2 days, the survivors at the main camp would watch the 3 men making their way to the mountain peak. On the 3rd day, Nando and Antonio left Roberto to reach the peak while Roberto rested. The base of the peak was a near vertical 300-foot wall encased in snow and ice. Determined to make it or die trying, Nando began carving out steps with a stick from his pack. He reached the summit shortly before Antonio, thinking that he would see the green valleys of Chile off in the distance. He was horrified to see nothing but mountain peaks in every direction because the co-pilot was mistaken and they were actually on the border between Argentina and Chile, meaning the valleys were still tens of kilometers away from where they were. The men returned back to Roberto, disheartened and exhausted. At sunset, they sipped some of the rum they found in the tail section, and Nando said to Roberto, "Can you imagine how beautiful this would be if we weren't dead men?" The next morning, now realizing the hike was going to be much longer than they thought, Antonio agreed to return to the crash site, so they only had to split the remaining food between 2 people. Using an aircraft seat as a sled on the descent, Antonio managed to make the journey that took them 3 grueling days in about an hour. Upon returning to the summit, Nando and Roberto scouted the area and decided on 2 peaks that seemed to have the least amount of snow of any on the horizon. With the largest peak behind them, they followed a ridge towards a valley and descended a considerable distance. The men hiked for several more days and finally reached a valley that Nando had seen from the mountaintop. This would end up being the source of the Rio San Jose River. They followed this all the way to the snow line and continued down from there. Gradually, there appeared more and more signs of a human presence. First, they found some evidence of a remote campsite, and then on the 9th day, some cows. That evening, resting on the riverbank and gathering firewood, miraculously, 3 men rode by on horseback on the other side of the river. They tried to shout to them, but the river was too loud. Thankfully, one of the men spotted them and stopped. Over the sound of the river, Nando and Roberto managed to communicate just one. The word was tomorrow. The following day, the men thankfully returned. They managed to throw a note over to him that read, "I come from plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there's still
Hang it up or something. Is it hanger?
Injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food, We are weak. When are you going to come fetch us? Please, we cannot even walk. Where are we? The man read the note and gave a sign that he understood. He then threw some bread over the river before taking off on his horse. He would ride the next 10 hours to get some help. For context, the area that they were in wasn't very developed, amounting to just some farm fields with very few roads or even cars. The man on horseback eventually reached a road and flagged down a driver who was able to take him to the police station. At the police station, the news was finally relayed to the army that there were survivors from Flight 571. Nando and Roberto were taken from the river to the town of Carico, where they rested and ate. On their journey, they had hiked 38 kilometers and it had taken a total of 10 days. Since the plane crash, Roberto had lost almost half his body weight and weighed only 97 pounds. The Chilean Air Force provided 3
I weigh 125. That's insane.
They flew to Carico and interviewed Nando and Roberto, and Nando volunteered to lead the helicopters to the crash site. On the afternoon of December 22nd, 1972, 2 helicopters carrying search and rescue personnel finally arrived at the crash site. The steep terrain allowed
This
for
block
only
is
one
finally
helicopter
done.
to land at a time and on only a single skid. In addition, due to the altitude and weight limits of the helicopters, only half the survivors would be taken on the first day. 4 members of the rescue team stayed back with the 7 survivors to spend their final night in the fuselage of the plane. The following morning, on December 23rd, all of the remaining survivors were removed from the mountains and transported to hospitals in Santiago. At the hospital, they were treated for altitude sickness, dehydration, frostbite, broken bones, scurvy, and malnutrition. In total, 16 of the 45 passengers had survived, and they spent a total of 72 days living on a glacier in the Andes Mountains. If you made it this far, I just wanted to thank you for watching. My name is Sean, and this is my channel, Scary Interesting. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and if this is the type of content that you enjoy, I hope you'll consider subscribing.
Deadliest mountain climbing disaster. 1961 Mont Blanc disaster.
Mont Blanc. Standing at 15,774 feet tall, Mont Blanc is the highest mountain in the Alps and the
Mont
second
Blanc.
most prominent mountain in all of Europe. Much like the Eiger, Mont Blanc is not a challenging mountain from most routes. But also much like the Eiger, there is a route so heinous and so difficult that it remained unconquered almost 200 years after the mountain had first been ascended. In fact, 25 years after the infamous Eiger North Face had already been completed, the central pillar of Fresnay had still not been successfully climbed. In 1961, a team of some of the best alpinists Europe had to offer hoped to be the first to conquer the legendary central pillar. This is their story. Sitting on the border of Italy to the east and France to the west, just south of Switzerland, is Mont Blanc. Its prominence and its height give it an imposing feel in the Mont Blanc Massif, where it towers over the rest of the mountains in the range. First ascended all the way back in 1786, most people ascend the mountain using that same route on the north side that faces France, overlooking the town of Chamonix. Overlooking the town of Courmayeur on the Italian side to the east are 3 massive granite pillars known as the Fresnay Pillars. The central pillar is a wall of sheer granite stretching for almost 3,000 feet and offers some of the most challenging and technical climbing anywhere in the Alps.
Damn.
The towns on either side of Mont Blanc have famous ski resorts for skiers in the winter and mountain climbers in the summer, and the two are connected by one of the highest cable cars anywhere on Earth. By June, the ski season comes to an end and the mountain climbing season begins. Some of the people who arrive during the summer season are just tourists looking to climb their first big mountain, while others are true alpinists whose passion lies in mountaineering. On the Italian side in 1961 was the tall, broad-shouldered, 31-year-old Walter Bonatti, who was one of the best alpinists anywhere on Earth. At 16 years old, he had left home to work nights as a machinist so he could learn to climb during the day. At 17, he saved a group of 9 that were stranded in a hailstorm on the north side of Mont Blanc. And at 18, he even solo summited the mountain.
Damn.
In the years following, he made trips to the
He's literally a
Philippines,
god.
even the
He's a
Himalayas,
Giga Chad.
where he participated in an expedition that made the first ascent of K2 in 1954. By 1961, he lived just 3 miles from the base of Mont Blanc and worked as a guide for anyone looking to climb mountains. In June of that year, Bonatti received a call from an engineer and aspiring mountain guide, Roberto Gallieni. Although he'd never met Gallieni, Bonatti knew of him because some of his mountaineering work. Gallieni was calling to ask if Bonatti wanted to make an attempt of the central pillar of Fresnay. Up to that point, Bonatti had made a dozen unsuccessful attempts of the central pillar, and so he obviously said yes and suggested they recruit 1 more climber and then make an attempt in July. Bonatti already knew the perfect third man, his best friend, 30-year-old Andrea Oggioni. The two of them had climbed together for years and had already discussed making another attempt at the central pillar. On Saturday, July 8th, Gallieni and Oggioni arrived at Walter's home in Courmayeur, where the three of them had dinner with Walter's family and planned for their attempt the following day. On Sunday morning, they took a cable car up to the Hellbrunner shelter at 10,000 feet, each carrying 50 pounds of equipment on their back. From the shelter, they started a long lateral trek across 8,000 feet of ice and snow toward another mountain in the range known as the Black Needle. From there, they'd have a straight shot right up the central pillar. That day, the weather was clear as far as they could see into France and Switzerland, and there were just 6 inches of soft snow on their path. That afternoon, as the men stopped to rest, Bonatti noticed 4 men coming down over an ice rise 900 feet above them, about a half-mile away. Looking through his binoculars, he saw that they were carrying enough equipment for a long climb, and the front man carried a pickaxe donning a small triangular French flag. The 4 of them moved quickly across the ridge and immediately up to Bonatti and the others. Once they were close enough, the leader went straight up to Bonatti, and the 2 of them hugged and shook hands. The man was none other than Pierre Mazot, a 36-year-old law professor. The 2 of them had met many times over the course of their travels. With him was Antoine Villet, a student and son of a French admiral, Robert Guillaume, a Paris baker, and Pierre Coleman, a French civil engineer. Apparently, they had come up from Chamonix on a cable car to 11,000 feet and had spent the day traveling downhill to reach the Fresnay. These men had also hoped to be the first to summit the central pillar. Bonatti and Mazot stepped away from the group for a moment to talk, and Bonatti suggested that the 2 teams make the ascent together. It would be easier because they could rope up together and more easily resist an avalanche or a storm. And it would be a joint French and Italian climb, just as Mont Blanc is a French-Italian mountain. So at sunset, in an incredible turn of events, 7 of the world's 20 best climbers would all make an attempt at the central pillar of Fresnay. At the base of the pillar, the men bivouacked for the night. The Italians spoke French, and so they spent the evening joking and laughing over dinner. The Italians had a small bivouac tent that they all shared, whereas the Frenchmen only had covers that enclosed each of their individual sleeping bags. At 10 p.m., they closed their sleeping bags for the night, and unbeknownst to them, the Milan Meteorological Service issued a report of a low-pressure system in the valley nearby that could move north into the Franco-Italian Alpine range by Tuesday evening. With it, there could be rain or light snow possible at high altitudes in the mountains. A seemingly innocuous report. On Monday, the hard work began. Crossing the ice fields the day prior was just a prelude to the almost 3,000 feet of solid granite and ice that awaited the men that day. At dawn, the weather was clear, their barometer stayed high, and 3 ropes alternated up the mountain, each representing a different set of individuals leading throughout the day. Monday went by rather uneventfully. The joint team made great progress that day, and it looked as though they had set themselves up perfectly for a summit the following day. By noon on Tuesday, July 11th,
Let me check my radar. Says we could get some bad storms later today. You know what I mean?
Hey, I'm new here.
Hi, how's it going? Just to make sure. Yeah, probably. Oh shit, we probably have to get off later because the storm's
I'm
approaching.
okay, what about you?
Pretty good. Just gotta be careful, or else. Get.
250 feet from the summit of the central pillar. They stopped for a lunch of canned meat and milk and knew that beyond the central pillar was an easy walk to the true summit and a successful climb of one of the last great problems in the Alps. An hour later, they noticed some clouds gathering over them, but they weren't worried. They were confident they would be finished by the time any storm arrived. Unfortunately, as they had just finished 140 feet of granite overhangs, just 110 feet from the top, the storm arrived in full force. The men quickly slid back down from the overhangs to a more guarded location. They left all of their already placed pitons, carabiners, and stirrups in the walls. They wouldn't have to set them all over again once the storm passed. As they arrived at a series of small ledges, the blizzard swirled and thunder and lightning exploded around them. The wind and snow were blinding, and at 14,500 feet, the pillar that they were on was like a
Are
lightning
you
rod
playing
on Mont Blanc.
Minecraft on your computer
The
or
men did
phone?
their best to
PlayStation
set up
5.
ledges that offered As the Frenchmen were splitting into two groups, without warning, Coleman's face was grazed by a bolt of lightning. Stunned by the strike, he wavered on the edge for a second before Mazzone leapt over and grabbed him to hold him up. The others grabbed a stimulant used at the time, known as Cormine, and forced it into his mouth.
That's cool.
Only then did he seem to come back to his senses.
Thanks.
The men then huddled together to try to wait out the storm. The Italians huddled together on one ledge in their bivouac tent. 3 of the Frenchmen huddled together on another ledge, and Coleman was given a more spacious ledge by himself to stretch out on. In a twist of fate, they were trapped so close to their final goal, just 250 feet above them. Beyond the easy snow ridge was even a shelter at the top, known as the Valo Hut.
How old are
From
you?
there, it was an
17.
easy descent to Chamonix. All they needed was a brief break in the storm for half a day, and they would be safe on the summit. Instead, there were 250 feet of shrouded, sheer granite and ice that would be impossible to climb in the current conditions. As the sun set that day, the storm got even more violent. In their sleeping bags and tent, the lightning flashes lit up the
That'd be
valley,
scary
giving
to be on a
the
mountain during a
danger of
thunderstorm.
brief strike. Holding the men to the wall was all of their metal climbing gear, which acted as perfect conductors. They desperately wanted to rid themselves of the gear, but that would have left them with no way up or down at the end of the storm. Suddenly, their legs convulsed as the group was struck by lightning, causing them all to yell wildly. Then again, a few minutes later, another bolt was so violent it almost knocked them off the ledge. One of the Italian men screamed out that they needed to get off the ledge, and Bonatti, although he didn't say it outwardly, was already secretly convinced that they were doomed. Finally, the thunderstorm moved away from the pillars and left just the sound of snow against the fabric of their coverings. That night, no one spoke and no one ate. The tent covering was suffocating, and the snow slowly buried them on the ledge. Bonatti refused to check his watch because he feared how slowly time would be passing in their current situation. On Wednesday at dawn, the group finally looked out of their coverings and were amazed by the amount of snow that had fallen. This was actually a good sign. Usually a large snowfall indicates that the storm is over. They got out and started to pack, but then another violent squall forced them back into their tent. The Frenchman asked Bonatti what his plan was, and he replied that he was still hopeful to ascend. It was technically the shortest road to safety compared to the long climb down. It would be a couple days to descend and only half a day to go up, and the amount of snow that had fallen drastically increased the risk of avalanches on the
Thanks, bro.
down below.
Oh my god, I love that
Plenty of
vase.
food and equipment, and so they could afford to wait for a break in the storm and make a quick push to the top. On top of that, in the summertime, bad weather like they were experiencing was usually short-lived. The 2 leaders agreed that when there was a clearing, they would go up ahead and prepare pitons and rope for the rest of the group. This would make it even easier when the storm finally broke. They might even be able to make it in the storm if the gear was already set. Unfortunately, there just never was any clearing. Hours went by, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Storms typically never last more than a day or two, and one day had already gone by. Bonatti was sure that they'd just have to wait one more, and then they would get their chance. In the meantime, the conditions were miserable on the ledges. They couldn't drink water because their stove wouldn't light in the wind, and the ledge was so tiny it was difficult to even use the washroom. Bonatti asked Gallieni, who was closest to the opening of their tent, which way the wind was blowing from. Gallieni answered west, which meant that the storm was still continuing, and so the 2 leaders spoke again, and Mazzone asked Bonatti if he thought they could make it despite the storm. Bonatti was known for being able to make the descent blind because of how familiar he was with the route. He thought that they could, but still wanted to wait just one more day. He was sure that the storm couldn't last another day. Then night rolled around on Wednesday. Then it was Thursday morning, and there was still no break in the storm. The men talked about Friday being better, but the hopefulness in their conversations was gone now. Bonatti was already working out the route down in his head. He was certain that the attempt was over now. By Thursday as well, the conditions had become even worse on the ledge. The moisture slowly soaked and froze their clothing. Still without water and getting very thirsty, they balled up snow and sucked on it, but this burned and chapped their mouths. All of Thursday went by, and in the evening, Bonatti finally confided in Ogioni that they needed to leave at all costs. He then set his wristwatch alarm for 3:30 a.m. on Friday, when he planned to start the long descent. The next morning, he screamed to the others that they needed to go down. If they didn't, they'd have no strength left by the time the storm passed. By the time they started the descent, the storm had raged for 60 hours. Still in zero visibility in the blizzard of wind and snow, the plan was for Bonatti to go first and set pitons and other anchors to arrange the rope. Mazzone would follow and help in any way he could. Then the others and Ogioni, the expert in rapid rope handling, would be last, as he always was, to recover the ropes at the end of each rappel. Then at 6 a.m., Bonatti took off blind down the sheer granite. The large rucksack of pitons weighed him down, and the snow and wind burned his eyes as he squinted at every rock, trying to recognize the way. Every rappel
How old
down
are
felt
you?
longer than the last.
17,
At times,
I've
4 or
already
5
said
of the men
this.
were all suspended by a single piton. At one point, while balancing on a ledge, midway through placing a piton, Coleman lost his grip in the cold and fell directly onto Bonatti. Bonatti instinctively shot out a hand and grasped at the rock to hold on as the two of them dangled in midair. Another time, as he was rappelling down, he ran out of rope, so he just dangled in midair over thousands of feet of rock and ice, barely able to yell to the others over the storm that he needed more rope. Over the course of the day, they painstakingly made their way to the base of the central pillar. They shivered violently and their teeth chattered in their soaked, frozen clothing. In the distance, they could hear avalanches thundering down the glaciers. When they finally started away from the pillar, the snow was up to their chests, making it difficult to walk. Now in the afternoon on Friday, they needed to find a spot to bivouac. Bonatti and Ogioni discussed sheltering in an igloo or an ice crevasse, and the two decided that the snow was too loose to use an igloo, and so they would search for a crevasse. Then finally, after 12 hours of rappels, the men stopped to rest on Friday night. The most exhausted among them was Coleman, so they tucked him into the bivouac tent and made him hot tea with the remaining liquid gas. The rest of them went without drinking because the gas stove still wouldn't light in the wind. In the brutal -30°C or -22
Ooh.
Fahrenheit weather, Coleman showed Bonatti his
That
purple
is
and black
chilly.
fingers. Bonatti, horrified, handed him the stove alcohol flask so that he could more easily massage his fingers. But Coleman immediately started drinking the poisonous liquid. Bonatti knocked it away and realized that Coleman had started to lose his grasp on reality. That night, the wind and snow swirled, even in the crevasse, and made it a slow, miserable sleep. The alarm sounded again at 3:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, and the men woke up to another 2 feet of snow that had fallen throughout the night. That day, they needed to pass through 3 critical areas if they wanted any hope of surviving. First were the treacherous Roche Gruber, a series of steep rocks and vertical cliffs. Next was the Fresnay Glacier, which was dangerously avalanche-prone and marked by crevasses, especially when they fall with fresh snow.
Severe thunderstorm watch, Jesus. That's escalating.
This near vertical ridge would lead them to a gentle slope to the Gamba hut and to salvation. They set off once again and struggled terribly walking through the chest-deep snow. Each subsequent man created a trench for the man behind to follow. The man who was nearly always in front was Bonatti, who had the most difficult job of creating the path. Before the Roche Gruber, there was just one short section of descent that they needed to make. Everyone was tied together with one rope, and the fresh snow was an avalanche waiting to happen. Bonatti instructed everyone to cross as quickly as possible and prepare to hold him if the snow broke away and carried him away. First, Bonatti crossed, then Ogioni, Gallieni, Mazod, and Coleman. When it was Vieille's turn, he just couldn't make it. He could barely stand, he kept falling, and Guillaume, in behind, had to push him along to keep him going. As they slowly made their way along, Bonatti went ahead and started down the rocks to begin setting equipment. He waited for 30 minutes, and only Coleman came to join him. He climbed back up to see what the holdup was, and Gallieni shouted to him that Vieille just couldn't make it. The team decided to rig up a pendulum-type system to swing Vieille across, and after it was rigged up and looked as though it would work, Bonatti continued down to set more gear. Then he waited again, and no one came down once again. He climbed back up and yelled again, asking what was happening, and the men yelled back that Vieille was dying. Soon, they were anchoring his lifeless body to a piton. When the rest of the Frenchmen arrived, they broke the news of Vieille's death to Coleman, who wept. They resumed descending the Roche Gruber with a new series of rappels. Ogioni handling the ropes, as Bonatti could always count on him to do. About midday, they heard voices from somewhere in the storm. These had to be rescuers, guides from Courmayeur who knew of their attempt, knew of the weather, and knew they must still be on the mountain somewhere. Bonatti had the entire group shout back at once to increase the chances of being heard, and for a time this gave them renewed strength because they knew that help had arrived. They continued down the rocks, and at one point, as Bonatti was finding a spot for a piton, he heard a cry. He turned around just in time to grab Ogioni's unconscious body sliding down the face. Bonatti looked at his friend face to face for the first time since they had started their descent and saw that he was suffering. In his eyes, there was doubt. Finally, at 5:30 p.m., they reached the Fresnay Glacier, and there was a brief clearing in the weather. They saw the surface of the glacier and how much snow had fallen, but they saw no tracks or signs of life. They wondered where the voices had come from, the voices that had given them hope. Now that it was clear that the rescuers had been somewhere else, as Bonatti himself put it, they felt the blackest despair. The men still had to descend the entire Fresnay Glacier and up the Innominata Ridge, and it was already getting close to dark. Bonatti had never seen so much snow in all of his years climbing, even in the wintertime. He and Mazot traded places at the front of the group as Ogioni collapsed every few steps. With nightfall quickly approaching, Bonatti decided to go ahead with Gallieni and install as much gear as he could for the others. They reached the ridge 30 minutes before nightfall and saw that it was completely covered with snow and the cracks were packed with ice. Bonatti attacked it anyway, knowing that if they didn't reach the Gamba hut, they wouldn't make it through the night. When the others eventually reached the ridge, Guillaume was not with them. He had died of the glacier in Ogioni's arms. The rest of them tied together again and started up the last obstacle. When Bonatti finally reached the top, it was 10 p.m. and they had been out for almost 7 days.
Where's that?
He struggled to place pitons and often had to hold the rope over his shoulder for the others as they climbed. He called for them to hurry, but there was just no hurry left in any of them. Ogioni was eventually no longer capable of climbing. He hung by a single carabiner that he just needed to unclip to continue, but he either lacked the strength or no longer understood how to do it. As desperately as he wanted to, Bonatti couldn't climb down to help him because over his shoulder was the lifeline that they needed to continue climbing. Eventually, after 3 hours in the same spot, he knew that he and Gallieni needed to climb down to the other side of the ridge and get to the Gamba hut to get help. That was the only way he could save them. He called down to the others what he was doing and then set off. He knew that Ogioni was still tied to the strong French leader Mazot and was sure that they'd be rescued in a few hours. Out of nowhere, Coleman unroped and climbed over everyone in a fury. Bonatti and Gallieni realized he was delirious and quickly hooked into him. He exclaimed that he was hungry and thirsty and asked where the hut was. It was clear that he had lost it. They had no choice but to bring him with them, or he would definitely die. Bonatti lowered Gallieni down first. Then when it was Coleman's turn, he had all but
Dude,
forgotten
we need
how to
30
climb.
more subs and then we're gonna get 200. 250 by before Christmas.
Over and over and almost pulled Bonatti down with him. They yelled and pleaded with him to calm down, but his mind was already gone. What should have taken an hour took almost 3 because of Coleman. When they finally reached the bottom of the treacherous bridge, there was just a few small snow hills between them and the hut. On their way, accidentally, Gallieni dropped one.
Can't believe I have
As
170
he bent down to pick it
subscribers.
up, he put his hand in his pocket to keep it warm. In his crazed state, Coleman thought that he was drawing a gun and attacked him. Gallieni got free of him, and then Coleman attacked Bonatti as well. The two of them eventually managed to restrain him by holding either end of the rope attached to him to keep him in place. They couldn't waste any more time. They had to get to the hut, but they couldn't untie the knots. They didn't have a knife to cut the rope. They eventually had to hold the rope in their teeth, slip it down their legs, and then as soon as they were slack, they took off running for the hut. Finally, in the pitch black, they reached an unremarkable-looking formation in the snow that was the Gamba hut. They banged on the outside until someone unlatched and opened the door. Bonatti stumbled in and over the bodies of people sleeping on the floor until someone said, "Walter, is that you?" Bonatti shouted back that Coleman was just outside, and 2 others were still on the other side of the Enominata Ridge. The men inside pulled off their crampons, undressed them, and gave them dry clothes and hot drinks. Shortly after that, they passed out. Bonatti woke up 3 hours later when the door to the hut opened and light flooded in. The man at the doorway was a good friend of his. The two hugged, and then the man told him that Ogioni was dead. Mazod, the only one still alive, stumbled through the doorway next and hugged Bonatti, and the two of them wept together. All of the bodies were recovered that day except for Vieille's. It took another 6 days to finally recover him from the Fresnay Glacier in the poor weather. Bonatti and Gallieni recovered in a clinic in Courmayeur, but would suffer permanent effects from frostbite in their hands and feet.
God.
Mazot, who was nearly in a coma when he was found, was flown to Lyon, where he almost had to have his feet amputated. In another tragic turn of events, Bonatti was vilified by the press for having survived when so many of his company had not. He was even shunned by the Society of Guides in Italy and never rejoined the group for the rest of his life. In his own memoir, Mazod would go on to write that he owed his life to Bonatti, and the French government awarded Bonatti the highest award, the Legion of Honor, for his effort. Ironically, in his own country of Italy, it took years for the public perception to recognize the truth of the matter. Following the events of the disaster, Walter Bonatti slowly returned to climbing. Starting with long walks in the woods, he gradually walked longer and higher, until he eventually returned to full strength and climbed Mont Blanc once again. Hello everyone, my name is Sean, and welcome to Scary Interesting. I want to quickly say a few words about the source material for this story. Typically, I use a variety of sources that vary a ton in quality from source to source. Unfortunately, some events only have the briefest articles written about them. Some events have long and thoughtful articles written about them. And some events were written by the people who experienced them and were able to capture everything they felt and went through. Walter Bonatti went on to write a book called Mountains of My Life, and this story is covered in one of those chapters. Between this chapter and a bunch of other articles is how I got the necessary details to cover this event. But this chapter in particular covers this event with such detail and captures the emotion and the struggle that Bonatti and the other men went through beautifully, and in far greater detail than what I captured here. I'd highly recommend you check it out if you enjoy this type of content. If you felt anything at the end of this story, I guarantee that it's nothing compared to how you'll feel after reading his account. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
Other banks go out of their way to make redeeming credit card rewards needlessly complicated, but Discover is a
Kayaking the sickest urban river in Australia. Oh, wait, hold on.
Mont Blanc.
Area flood watch. I always ignore the flood watches because, wait. The Mont Blanc
Thank you,
tunnel
Nature.
fire.
Seeing that life
Another
is
Mont Blanc.
creating new targeted
I think
blends
that's what it's
to help.
called.
So
So
when
if I'm
our
mispronouncing
sleep,
it.
stress, and immune health are thrown off, new nature-made well blends can help us find balance.
On the 24th of March 1999, a transport truck caught fire while travelling from France to Italy through the Mont Blanc tunnel. The fire, deep in the heart of the Alps, would turn the tunnel into an oven that would remain too hot for any human to enter for days after the flames were extinguished, and would ultimately cost dozens of people their lives. Construction began on the Mont Blanc tunnel in 1959. To link together Chamonix in France with Courmayeur in Italy. The idea of a tunnel through the Alps was suggested to the Italian Parliament in 1907, but the turmoil of 2 world wars delayed any action for half a century. Even when the plan was resumed in the 1950s, it was still regarded as a highly ambitious project. 2 newly formed organizations took responsibility for half of the tunnel each. The Autoroutes et Tunnel de Mont Blanc, or ATMB from France, and the Società Italiana per Azione per il Traforo del Monte Bianco, or SITMB, from Italy. Each organization began drilling from their side. 3 years later, in 1962, the drilling stage was completed as workers from the 2 nations met in the middle. 3 years after that, work on the interior of the tunnel was successfully completed. After being inaugurated by the presidents of France and Italy, the tunnel was opened to the public on the 19th of July, 1965. At the time, it was 3 times longer than any other highway tunnel in the world. No longer would cars and trucks have to negotiate hairpin turns on mountain roads to make the journey across the Alps. Though just 11.6 kilometers or 7.2 miles long, the tunnel saved drivers on average 2 hours on the road. The new route was understandably popular. It symbolized unity in a continent that had been ravaged by war in the early part of the 20th century. As the president of Italy put it, "This work of peace is for the world a symbol of willingness and trust in the virtue of the work of humans, which builds, day after day, the life of nations." As well as a symbol of peace between countries, the tunnel was also an excellent source of revenue for its operators. In the late 1990s, the ATMB were charging tolls for use of the tunnel that were, on average, around 91% pure profit. Heavy vehicles were particularly lucrative for them, and so they would allow as many through as they could, often ignoring safety measures concerning the minimum distance between vehicles in the process. From an Italian perspective, the Mont Blanc tunnel was also extremely lucrative. It had become responsible for around a third of all freight travelling from Italy to northern Europe. While some safety measures had been introduced during the 1990s, such as new surveillance cameras, emergency shelters, a sprinkler system and a fire detection system, safety was not an area that was considered a priority. There hadn't been a single fatality in the tunnel since its opening. On the morning of the 24th of March 1999, Belgian truck driver Gilbert de Grave set out on a regular route of his from France into Italy. On this day, his load consisted of around 9,000 kilograms, or 9 tons, of margarine, and around 12,000 kilograms, or 12 tons, of flour, all of which was stowed in his refrigerated lorry. As he passed through the toll booth on the French side of the Mont Blanc tunnel at 10:46 a.m., everything was normal. Not long into his journey through the tunnel, at around 10:49 a.m., he noticed cars travelling in the opposite direction, flashing their headlights at him. A quick check in his wing mirrors revealed that white smoke was pouring from under his cabin. While this would undoubtedly have been a cause for concern, it was not likely to be considered a major emergency.
I think a radiator failure.
16 trucks had caught fire in the Mont Blanc tunnel, and all of them had been extinguished by the driver on the spot. By 10:53 a.m., he was 6 kilometers, or 3.7 miles, into the tunnel, almost exactly halfway through. At this point, he stopped to address the situation, but was immediately forced out of and away from his lorry when it burst into flames. He quickly decided that he was unable to fight the fire, and fled, running the remaining distance to the Italian entrance of the tunnel. By this time, the French authorities were aware that several smoke detectors had gone off. The Italian authorities were not. Their smoke detectors had been switched off after too many false alarms. 1 minute after the truck burst into flames, the alarm was raised by another driver, prompting the French and Italian operators to get in touch with one another. By 10:55 a.m., all traffic had been stopped from entering the tunnel, and fire alarms were sounding throughout. Remaining inside the tunnel were at least 10 cars and 18 trucks, 50 people in total. Those travelling from the French side could not get past the burning lorry. Some car drivers were able to turn around, but for most truck drivers, there simply was not enough space to do so. By 10:57 a.m., more than 1/10 of the tunnel was completely filled with smoke. De Grave's cargo of margarine was acting as fuel for the fire. Operators on both sides could see smoke on their surveillance cameras, but due to low picture quality, were unable to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from.
I saw a meme on Instagram where it's like the picture of the universe, and it's like 1080p, a security camera 10 feet away, and it's just 144p. Dude, security cameras are ass.
From the nearby town of Chamonix responded, and were at the scene by 10:59 a.m. As they entered the tunnel, they found that the wiring powering the lighting had melted away, and the tunnel was in complete darkness. This, combined with the smoke and multiple abandoned vehicles, made it impossible to carry on. The firefighters left their trucks and sought refuge in the emergency fire cubicles that were situated at regular intervals alongside the roadway. From there, they could hear the sound of burning fuel rolling down the road, and the resulting explosion of tires and fuel tanks. By now, many other vehicles were also on fire. At 11:11 a.m., more firefighters arrived, this time from the Italian side, but they too had to abandon their vehicles. Realizing that the fire cubicles would not offer sufficient protection from this fire, they started to search for the other trapped firefighters. A security guard from the Italian side, Pierluca Tinazzi, rode into the tunnel on his motorbike in an attempt to reach survivors. In his last communication with the control room, he said that he had found an unconscious lorry driver on his way, so had dragged him into one of the fire cubicles for protection. Unfortunately, the cubicle they took refuge in was too close to the fire for them to be rescued in time, and both men passed away. In an effort to help people escape, operators on the Italian side began to pump fresh air into the tunnel. hoping to neutralize the deadly smoke. This was a serious error in judgment, as the fresh air...
What? That's stupid. I was just, before he even says he was about to say an error, I'm like, won't that give the fire oxygen? Look, I tried to make like a little incendiary device, and I sealed all my inflammable components in, and I learned that day that you need oxygen to make fire burn. This is just gonna make it worse.
acted as further fuel to the fire,
Oxygen.
spreading the flames even more quickly, and ultimately reducing the breathable air available for the people still trapped inside. By 11:30 a.m., less than 40 minutes after the fire started, the smoke had reached the French side of the tunnel. It was impossible to reach the fire to extinguish it, and so it continued to burn for 53 hours, reaching temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,830 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt the asphalt of the roadway. All of the stranded firefighters were rescued 5 hours later by a third crew that reached them via a ventilation duct. They were taken to hospital, all of them in a serious condition. One would later pass away from injuries caused by heat and smoke. In total, 29 other people died trapped in their vehicles, and 9 more died while trying to escape. An extensive investigation was launched involving 70 investigators, 160 witnesses, 60 lawyers, and more than 200 plaintiffs.
Oh my god.
Eventually, 16 people and companies were tried for manslaughter in 2005, including the lorry driver, Gilbert DeGrave, the makers of the lorry, Volvo, and the managers of the tunnel, the ATMB and SITMB. In total, 13 individuals were found guilty, receiving sentences which ranged from suspended prison sentences to 6 months in prison. Gilbert DeGrave received a 4-month suspended sentence, while the charges against Volvo were dropped completely. Repairs would take 3 years, and would incorporate a major re-evaluation of safety measures. New interventions included extra traffic lights to help stem the flow of traffic in the event of an accident, the installation of evacuation tunnels, 78 firefighting spots, 3,680 new smoke detectors, video contact with the security bays, and a remote site for cargo inspection to ensure that vehicles were not overheating when they entered the tunnel. For the act of heroism that ultimately cost him his life, Pierluca Tinazzi was posthumously given an award for civil valor by the Italian Republic. Despite an extensive investigation, one thing remains unclear: how the fire started in the first place. The most popular theory is that a lit cigarette thrown from another vehicle entered the cab's engine induction snorkel and then set an air filter on fire. Whatever the cause, the Mont Blanc tunnel fire was a rare and terrible accident, one that, with vigilance and an awareness of the dangers inherent in a long, narrow tunnel under a mountain range, should never be repeated. Narrow tunnel under a mountain range should never be repeated.
Wow, I did not even measure it. Like, that's actually pretty coincidental. Hope I can get all these slots filled in before I go to school. I'm gonna go eat myself some lunch. Bye.